That night, I sat in the back seat of a taxi, thinking it was just another ride home, and less than 10 minutes later, I had more than 8 guns pointed in my direction. The driver was shaking, sweating cold. He looked at me through the rearview mirror and said just one sentence, "Don't get out, trust me." And right after that, the sirens exploded and the police boxed us in like we were in the middle of a war I didn't even know I was part of. Let me ask you something before I go on. Hit subscribe and like this video, because this story is not just entertainment. If you stay with me until the end, you might start seeing fear, panic, and this thing I call the hidden truth in a totally different way in your own life. By the way, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from right now? I love knowing how far these stories can travel. The craziest part is that, in that moment, it felt like everybody knew who I was, except me. To the police, I was a hostage in danger. To the taxi driver, I was someone he had to protect at any cost. To certain people I didn't even know, I was a problem that needed to disappear quietly. And me, I honestly thought I was just a regular employee going home after a long, exhausting day. Let me tell you something a little controversial right from the start. The person holding the gun is not always the most dangerous one in the scene. Some people only need an ID badge, a contract in, or a fancy title to cause a lot more damage than any movie criminal. That night, surrounded by patrol cars, I found out the real battlefield wasn't the street. It was the narrative. Who was going to decide what I was? Victim, accomplice, crazy, heroine. Wasn't just about facts. It was about who told the story first. And here's the counterintuitive part. The moment I felt the most fear, the most intense panic, was exactly the moment I had the fastest chance to get free. It wasn't when they pointed guns at me, or when they shouted my name. It was when they tried to convince me, with a calm, authoritative voice, that I only had to do one thing. Step out of the car, trust us, let us handle the rest. You know that quick reward they sell you your whole life. Stay quiet, don't question, let the people who know better decide for you. That's exactly the moment when your hidden truth dies, and you become just a background character in your own story. I know you've been through this in a different setting. At work, when someone told you to sign something just to speed things up. In your family, when they said, "Don't make it complicated. We've always done it this way." In a relationship, when they called you dramatic for feeling that something was wrong. Maybe you've never been inside a taxi surrounded by cops, but you have been surrounded by opinions, judgments, and subtle threats. And deep down, you felt that silent panic. If I speak up, I could lose everything. If I stay quiet, I might lose myself. In this video, I'm going to take you back inside that car with me. You're going to understand why a taxi driver in panic begged me to trust him, why the police surrounded us like I was just another chess piece on the board, and how a single file I opened at work turned an ordinary person into a target for people who live off hiding things. More than that, I'm going to show you how, on the worst day of my life, I discovered that fear can be a warning, not a prison. If you stay with me until the end of this story, I can promise you one very straightforward reward. You will never look at a moment of panic, at a trust me order, or at an official version of the truth the same way again. It might hurt a little. It might poke places inside you that you'd rather not revisit, but it might be exactly the push you needed to stop handing over the steering wheel of your life to whoever happens to be yelling the loudest. So do this now. Subscribe, hit the like button, turn on notifications, and get ready. Because I'm about to tell you, in detail, what really happened after "Don't Get Out, Trust Me," and how that one night inside a taxi changed everything, not just for me, but for how I see fear, panic, and the hidden truth to this day. That night, the city felt like it was on silent mode, as if someone had turned the volume of the world way down. Olivia walked out of her office building with a tired face and her mind on autopilot, just wanting to get home. She raised her hand, called a random cab, and that's when Ethan appeared, just another driver in a sea of drivers. The back seat smelled like old coffee and recent rain, that classic scent of a car that's been running all day long. Outside, headlights sliced through the avenue and everything felt absolutely normal. No sign of panic anywhere. Funny thing is, it's exactly in those moments when everything looks ordinary that fear likes to hide between the lines. If you were there, you'd probably think it was just another ride, Nothing special, zero danger. By the way, tell me something. What city are you watching this video from right now? I ask because every city has its own way of hiding a hidden truth behind lit-up windows. As the taxi pulled away, Olivia leaned back in the seat, having no idea that tonight would split her life into a before and after. The radio mentioned something about an incident in the area, but she let the news pass like it was just another commercial. Life is like that. We ignore little signs until they blow up in our face and start demanding attention. And before I tell you what really happened in that car, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Hit the like button too, because that tells YouTube you enjoy this kind of narrative full of tension. She had no idea, but what started out as a normal ride was about to sink into panic, fear, and a hidden truth nobody wanted to face. Olivia was the kind of person who lived on autopilot, like a lot of people you probably know, maybe even you. Same route every day, same streets, same wasted time thinking about everything and, at the same time, about nothing at all. She got into Ethan's cab without looking twice at his face, just enough to decide he didn't look like the scary stranger type. Wrinkled suit, stubble on his face, tired eyes, that look of someone who works more hours than their health would approve. That's where fear starts tricking us. We judge who's a threat based on appearance, and we're usually way off. From the front seat, Ethan asked where she was going, and Olivia answered with her address like she was reciting a daily mantra. The engine purred in a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, and the fogged window from their breathing created a movie-like scene no one noticed. Ethan turned on the radio at a low volume, and a quick news bit about a police incident cut through the air for a few seconds. He shot a quick glance at the rearview mirror, but Olivia was too busy checking her messages to notice that subtle flash of panic. And that's how the hidden truth gets closer. It doesn't arrive screaming. It always shows up disguised as, it's probably nothing. If you think about your own routine, how many times have you ignored the feeling that something was off? That weird chill, that coincidence that keeps repeating, that number or sign that insists on showing up everywhere. Life keeps dropping hints, but we keep hitting the emotional snooze button. In that cab, that night, both Olivia and Ethan were about to wake up in a way they would never forget. And, whether you realize it yet or not, understanding this story can help you sharpen the way you read the signs in your own life. Notice how everything starts with tiny details we usually sweep under the rug of the mind. If Olivia had the habit of paying attention to her own gut feelings, she might have noticed something different about that driver. It wasn't just exhaustion. There was a controlled kind of fear in him, like someone trying to put out a house fire with a glass of water. Have you ever felt that? Walking into a place or meeting someone and suddenly your body reacts before your mind understands why? Your heart races, your breathing changes, and your thoughts rush to rationalize it. Come on, I'm just being paranoid. Nothing's wrong. But a lot of times, it's not paranoia. It's your inner radar trying to protect you from a panic that doesn't have a face yet. Here's a practical tip. Next time you feel that discomfort for no clear reason, don't just ignore it. Stop. Look around. Ask yourself, what exactly is making me uneasy right now? What hidden truth might be behind this feeling? Sometimes it's a look, sometimes it's a silence, sometimes it's the way someone grips a steering wheel. If Olivia had asked herself that question a few minutes earlier, maybe the story would have gone a different way. But like most of us, she preferred to believe she was just tired and went back to staring at her phone. By the way, if this story is already stirring something inside you, consider subscribing to the channel to keep going on this journey with me. Because believe me, understanding how fear works and how the hidden truth shows up can completely change how you make decisions. Ethan, up front, was fighting a silent battle, panic on the inside, the need to look normal on the outside. And that inner conflict was about to spill out through the cracks of the rearview mirror and hit Olivia hard. Outside, the city followed its usual script of honking horns, distant ambulances, and windows blinking like little urban constellations. Inside that moving taxi, though, a completely different story was being written, one Olivia had never agreed to be part of. Ethan knew those streets with his eyes closed. He'd driven hundreds of people along those same routes, but tonight, everything felt off. You know when you walk through a familiar place and still feel like you're in unfamiliar territory. That's fear whispering gently, reminding you that what we call normal is often just a comfortable illusion. He checked the mirror again and again, and every pair of headlights behind them looked like a threat disguised as just another car. It wasn't just panic. It was the certainty that something that should have stayed buried in his past was chasing him down in the present. And when the past decides to collect, it doesn't knock politely. It kicks the door open and drags the hidden truth out by the hair. Olivia, clueless to all this, replied to texts about work, about friends, about things that felt important 5 minutes ago. Little did she know that in just a few moments, her priorities were about to be rearranged inside her head. It's strange how we organize life as if we controlled the whole script, and then suddenly one scene changes everything. Sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's a medical result, sometimes it's just a taxi ride that spins out of the ordinary. If you look at your own story, I bet there's a moment when everything flipped upside down without warning. That night, the fuse for that flip was already in place, just waiting for the spark that hadn't happened yet. And that spark would start with something apparently simple, a route that suddenly didn't look like the right route anymore. Olivia knew the way home by heart. She'd done that route so many times she could practically draw it with her eyes closed. That's why when the cab turned down a street she didn't immediately recognize, a small alert went off in the back of her mind. It wasn't a blaring alarm, more like a whisper. Weird. I don't think he usually turns here. But, like most people, she rushed to justify it. He must know a shortcut. Maybe he's avoiding traffic. You've done that too, right? Felt that something was wrong, but instead of trusting your gut, you rushed to make up a logical excuse. In those moments, fear doesn't show up to paralyze you. It shows up as a warning, but we insist on hitting the ignore button. Ethan saw the slight frown on her face in the mirror, that tiny crease between her eyebrows, and the panic inside him jumped, because he knew that from that moment on, it would get harder and harder to keep the hidden truth hidden. He took a deep breath, adjusted his grip on the wheel, and tried to look natural, like a driver who just knows a few extra routes. Meanwhile, Olivia was having a silent conversation with herself. Do I ask where he's taking me, or do I just wait and see? If you were in her place, what would you do? Speak up right away or wait a bit longer to see how it plays out? It's in these small crossroads that we decide whether we're the main character or just a background extra in our own story. A simple question could have changed the course of that ride, but the fear of sounding dramatic kept the words stuck in her throat. And when we swallow what we should say, life finds a way to shout louder just a little farther ahead. That's exactly what started happening when, a few blocks later, the vibe inside the car got way too heavy to ignore. As the car kept moving, the city lights seemed to change tone, like someone had messed with the contrast settings of the world. Olivia started to notice that those weren't exactly the storefronts she was used to seeing on her way home. The number of people on the sidewalks dropped, and the streets felt narrower, darker, more intimate than they should have. Inside her, fear stopped being a whisper and turned into a clear discomfort, like that knot in your stomach before a big decision. Ethan, on the other hand, kept adjusting the rearview mirror with an almost annoying frequency, as if he needed to be sure no one was following them. Every headlight behind them was a potential threat. Every motorcycle passing by felt like a message from his past. Can you imagine the mix of panic and self-control he needed to keep driving like nothing was wrong? On the outside, he was just a focused driver. On the inside, he was a man calculating every possible route to protect someone who didn't even know him. The hidden truth of that route was pulsing, ready to explode, wanting to be revealed, but still chained by fear of the consequences. Olivia squeezed the handle of her purse tighter, that unconscious gesture we make when we feel like we're about to lose control of a situation. She thought about asking to get out, but her mouth didn't follow her thoughts, and silence became an accomplice to what was coming next. Outside, the distant sound of sirens began creeping in, first like a faint echo, then like a loud announcement that something was going on. Her heart sped up without her really knowing why, like her body understood the weight of the moment before her mind did, and it was right at this point in the ride, where fear, panic, and far-off sirens met, that the night stopped being ordinary once and for all. Ethan's next move, and the next words that came out of his mouth, would be the trigger that turned a simple ride into a story Olivia would never forget. Ethan had driven through that area thousands of times, but that night, Everything felt slightly off, just a little out of place. He knew every traffic light, every corner, every pothole in the asphalt, and even so, he felt a chill on the back of his neck that didn't match routine at all. It wasn't just tiredness, it was that strange gut feeling that comes before panic, when the body picks up on danger before the mind catches up. Olivia, in the back seat, still didn't see anything wrong, and that made everything even more tense because only one of them could feel the storm coming. The first real sign that something was wrong wasn't screaming, or a gunshot, or a crash. It was a different kind of silence. Out of nowhere, the movement on the street seemed to slow down, like the city had held its breath for a few seconds. The headlights behind the taxi grew more distant, and for a few meters they looked like they were alone in that little slice of the world. Ethan thought it was strange, because he knew that stretch was usually busy, full of cars, honks, and people rushing around. Weird, he muttered under his breath, almost to himself, like someone talking to his own fear to see if it calms down. The hidden truth is that most of the time, the first sign of danger is exactly that subtle change everyone else ignores. Have you noticed how, before big problems, there are always small hints that something is out of place? That street that suddenly looks emptier than it should, that friend who changes their tone, that email that pops up at the worst possible moment. If you learn to watch for these signs, you can avoid a lot of unnecessary panic and last-minute decisions made under pressure. And hey, before this story really heats up, hit subscribe and like this video so you can keep following these tension-filled narratives. Because learning how fear talks to you, in the form of a warning, can be the difference between repeating mistakes and seeing the hidden truth in time. Olivia noticed the second sign that something was wrong when she saw, in the reflection of the window, the change in Ethan's eyes. It wasn't some dramatic shift. He didn't scream, didn't slam the brakes, didn't do anything movie-like. It was way more subtle than that. His eyes, which had just looked tired, suddenly carried a specific tension, like he was trying to measure the distance of an invisible threat. He checked the rearview mirror with an irritating frequency, like someone looking for a specific car among many. Except that, at that moment, there weren't many cars. And that was exactly what made the fear grow quietly inside his chest. Curious, Olivia took her eyes off her phone and started paying more attention, even though she still tried to play down what she felt. He's probably just a very careful driver, she thought, trying to push the panic away with a rational explanation. The mind does that all the time. It invents logical justifications so we don't have to face the hidden truth that's bothering us inside. If you've ever felt someone acting weird but told yourself, "It's just in my head," you know exactly how that works. Many times, it's not in your head. It's your instinct trying to protect you from something you haven't fully understood yet. A simple practice is to start taking small changes in people seriously. Tone of voice, eyes, posture, hesitation. When someone suddenly tenses up, it's worth asking what's going on instead of pretending you didn't notice. Ethan wanted to look normal, but the fear was already spilling out through the gestures and micro-expressions he couldn't control anymore. If Olivia had been more in tune with her emotional radar, maybe she would have realized that that ride was no longer just another ride. And you, watching this, might already be remembering a time when you ignored exactly this kind of signal. The third sign came from outside, as a reminder that danger rarely shows up alone. The distant sound of sirens started to grow. At first, it was just another city noise, that background sound we get used to and stop noticing in big urban chaos. But as the taxi moved forward, the sirens became clearer, like they were converging toward the same area they were entering. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, and the cold knot of fear in his stomach morphed into almost full-blown panic held just below the surface. The hidden truth, in that moment, was that he knew this wasn't a coincidence. Not this time. Not on this night. Olivia looked out the window and noticed the reflection of blue and red lights starting to show up in the distance, dancing on the buildings. She frowned, not because she understood the risk, but because she felt the atmosphere shift, like the air had gotten heavier. "Do you hear that?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling her heartbeat speed up a little. Ethan nodded quickly. The kind of nod from someone who already knows exactly what those sirens mean for his past. Have you ever had that feeling that the whole world was closing in on a secret you didn't want exposed? That's the kind of pressure that makes people take impulsive actions, driven by fear and panic instead of clarity. By the way, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this story from, with all this tension and so many layers of hidden truth? I ask because, whether it's a big city or a small town, sirens are always the same message. Something serious is happening somewhere. And at that moment, Olivia and Ethan started to realize that this somewhere might be exactly where they were. Without fully understanding why, she straightened up in her seat, like someone instinctively preparing for an impact they haven't seen yet. From a wider perspective, that beginning of a ride is practically a live manual on how subtle signals show up before big crises. First comes the sense that something is off, then the inconsistencies in people's behavior, and finally, an external event that confirms the warning, that works for relationships, work, business, health, and even something as apparently simple as a taxi ride. For example, at a job, the first sign of trouble might be a change in your boss's behavior, then meetings without you, then a sudden layoff. In finances, it could be a tiny little news story about a company, then a small dip in its shares, and finally, a full-on crash. Fear, when used well, isn't the enemy. It's a counselor asking for your attention before the hidden truth explodes. The problem is that most people have learned to shut that counselor down because they're afraid of looking dramatic, paranoid, or too much. If Olivia had been raised to trust her own gut more, maybe she would have asked more direct questions right at the start of that ride. She could have said something simple like, "Is this really the fastest way?" Or, "Why do you seem so tense tonight?" Questions like that, asked at the right moment, often disarm dangerous situations before panic takes over. You can practice this in your own life with small things. Observe, feel, ask when something seems out of place. And of course, if you want to keep learning how to read these signs through stories like this, you know what to do. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Here, the goal isn't just to entertain you, it's to use suspense so you can sharpen your perception and avoid being blindsided by the next hidden truth. Olivia didn't have that level of awareness yet, so she kept silently wrestling with that feeling that something was very wrong. And the tension in the air just kept getting thicker and thicker, setting the stage for the moment when nothing could be ignored anymore. The fourth sign showed up when the taxi stopped at a red light that, on normal days, never stayed red for that long. Ethan's internal clock knew that light had a rhythm, and that night it felt stretched out, like time itself was conspiring. He looked to the right and noticed a car parked on the corner. Headlights dim, windows tinted darker than usual for that area. There was no one getting in or out, no one walking by on the sidewalk, just that car sitting there, watching. Panic became something solid in Ethan's chest because he recognized that kind of invisible presence that pretends it's not there. The hidden truth he still didn't have the courage to tell Olivia was that that car looked a lot like the style of people he really wanted to avoid. Olivia followed his gaze, but unlike him, she didn't have the experience to read danger in details that subtle. She felt fear grow inside, but didn't know if she was reacting to the car, to the silence, to the sirens, or to her own inner anxiety. "Are you okay?" she finally asked, giving voice at last to the discomfort that had been building up since the change in route. "I'm fine," he answered way too fast, in that tone that convinces no one, not the one speaking, nor the one listening. You've gotten an answer like that, haven't you? When someone pretends to be calm, but their voice completely gives them away. That's why panic doesn't usually come from what's said. It comes from what's felt between the lines. Olivia sensed that difference, and her fear stopped being just a possibility and became a warning she could no longer ignore. It was exactly then that the world outside decided to rip the mask off what was about to happen. And when the light finally turned green, nothing about that night looked even remotely normal anymore. When the taxi started moving again, the sound of the sirens was no longer distant. It was coming from every direction. It was like the entire city had decided to focus its attention on that one small yellow car lost in the traffic. The blue and red lights began reflecting stronger on the windows, painting Olivia's face with emergency colors. Ethan realized the time for doubts was over, and what used to be just fear now flirted directly with panic, the kind that locks up your body. He knew, with painful clarity, that the net was closing in, and the hidden truth about his story was about to knock on his door. Olivia stared outside, still not understanding whether all that movement had anything to do with them or was just another police operation. But inside him, Ethan recognized the pattern. Squad cars coming from different streets, slowing down, forming a funnel around the taxi. Have you ever been in a situation where you just knew, without anyone saying a word, that the problem had finally found you? It's a strange feeling, a mix of relief for no longer needing to run and extreme fear of what's going to happen next. Panic, when it reaches that point, isn't just sweaty palms. It's the deep certainty that a decision has to be made immediately. In that suffocating atmosphere, Ethan took a deep breath and realized he couldn't protect Olivia with silence and weird shortcuts anymore. He knew that in seconds, the police would show up with a rehearsed version of the story, and she'd be trapped between two narratives. Before that happened, he'd have to say something that would break the illusion of a normal ride and show her the size of the danger. A single command, one urgent sentence, would decide the difference between her instinct to run and her chance to survive. And it's exactly there, in that instant, when fear turns into action and the entire city seems to shrink around the taxi, that the next scene of this story begins. The exact moment when everything stopped looking normal was ridiculously simple. A red light. The taxi stopped. The engine settled into that trapped little rumbling, and for a few seconds, the whole world felt suspended in midair. That's when the sound of sirens finally exploded right on top of them, so loud it felt like they were coming up out of the pavement. Olivia looked back through the fogged-up glass and saw blue and red lights swallowing the street at a frightening speed. Panic didn't hit all at once. It came in waves, first her heart racing, then her palms sweating, then her mind scrambling for an explanation. She grabbed her bag tighter, instincts yelling, "Get out! Run! Leave! Now!" But before she could reach the door handle, Ethan shot his arm out with a kind of urgency that left no room for doubt. His eyes, which had been trying to look calm, now let fear spill out with no mask at all. In that nearly desperate state, he fired off the sentence that would change everything. "Don't get out. Trust me." It didn't sound like a threat. It didn't sound like some movie villain. It sounded like a desperate plea from someone in a fistfight with his own panic. The hidden truth behind that sentence was too heavy to fit into a few words, but it was all there in his expression. Right there, Olivia felt she wasn't just a passenger in some random ride anymore. She was a piece in a game she didn't even know she'd been pulled into. Before I keep going, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit like, because this story is only going to get more intense from here. This isn't just about scaring you. It's about teaching you to recognize when a simple phrase is packing a lifetime of fear and hidden truth. And at that intersection, between sirens, flashing lights, and shallow breathing, a choice was being born that would mark 3 lives at once. Olivia froze for a moment, like her brain had crashed between 2 opposing orders, instinct and trust. On one hand, everything inside her screamed to get out of the car as fast as possible, away from that man in panic. On the other, there was something in Ethan's eyes that didn't match the image of a soulless kidnapper you picture when you hear sirens. He was shaking slightly, but not like someone caught doing something wrong, more like someone who knows the worst part hasn't even started yet. It's wild how fear can wear so many faces, and one of them is exactly this blend of protectiveness and desperation. "Trust me" is a phrase people throw around all the time, but in that context, it sounded more like a reverse cry for help. Olivia stared at the door, then at him, and realized any decision she made right there could cost a lot. Have you ever been in a moment where you had to decide fast, with barely any context, and panic wouldn't let your thoughts line up? Those are the times when we need to have practiced, beforehand, the ability to breathe and see beyond the surface. The hidden truth almost never sits in what someone says, but in how they say it, and in the energy that comes with the words. Olivia didn't know that consciously, but she felt that this was deeper than just some guy afraid of getting arrested. "Why can't I get out?" she asked, her voice cracking as she tried to hang on to some rationality in the middle of chaos. Ethan swallowed hard, glanced quickly in the rearview mirror, and answered in a strained whisper, "Because out there isn't as safe as it looks right now." That one line was enough to tear apart the simple, dangerous driver story her mind had built around him. And while she tried to figure out what that even meant, the police cars started positioning themselves like they were surrounding a very important target. From the outside, the scene looked crystal clear to anyone not paying close attention. A taxi boxed in, sirens blaring, guns aimed. From a distance, the script wrote itself: suspicious driver, passenger in danger, heroic police coming in to save the day. But reality, like always, carried a hidden truth nobody on the outside could see. The fear driving Ethan wasn't fear of getting caught. It was fear that Olivia would step out straight into the wrong hands. He knew things she didn't, recognized patterns she didn't, saw threats where she only saw authority. And that's where panic turns dangerous. When one side looks obviously right, we stop questioning anything. Olivia, like most normal people, had been raised to believe police meant safety, end of fear, end of danger. They're going to get me out of here. They're going to protect me, was the automatic thought trying to organize itself in her head. At the same time, the man in front of her, shoulders tight and breathing heavy, was begging her to stay put. Can you imagine that conflict? On one side, the official story. On the other, the gaze of someone who seems to know more than they're saying. This is exactly the kind of crossroads where life tests whether you're going to run on autopilot or question the first version of the story. The hidden truth wasn't in the sirens or in the gun barrels. It was in the shades of fear on every face around her. Olivia looked around again and noticed some of the squad cars were positioned in a strange way, almost too strategic. It didn't feel like a simple surround. It felt like choreography, a staged scene meant to reinforce an already written narrative. And while she tried to process that, a voice over a megaphone shattered what little silence was left inside and outside the taxi. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle with your hands visible." The voice boomed, firm, authoritative, not used to being questioned. The sound cut through the glass and drove straight down Olivia's spine, her whole body reacting before her mind could. She jolted slightly in her seat, like that command had pulled some invisible cord connected to her muscles. Fear became physical, turned into the urge to open the door and obey, because that's what we're trained to do from childhood. Obey authority. From the front seat, Ethan looked even more tense, like every word coming out of that megaphone was pushing them closer to a cliff. "Don't," he muttered, eyes still glued to the mirror, his voice cracking between panic and determination. "They think you're just a victim, but you have no idea what's really going on behind this," he added quickly. Olivia's throat went dry, because suddenly this stopped being a neat scene with heroes and a villain and turned into a mental labyrinth. Who was telling the truth? The loud voice outside or the shaky, close one inside? Have you ever been split between what the whole world says is right and what, deep down, feels off to you? That's exactly where fear stops being just an emotion and becomes a tool to control people. Whoever controls fear controls the narrative, and whoever controls the narrative often controls everyone's fate. By the way, if you're still deep into this story with me, hit that like button. It tells me you connect with this kind of reflection. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now, because from this point on, every decision Olivia makes will carry huge weight. While the voice on the megaphone kept insisting, another softer voice inside her mind whispered, "Think before you move. Look for the hidden truth." Olivia took a deep breath, trying to grab onto some thread of rationality in the middle of that storm of noise and emotion. A part of her wanted to scream back, another part wanted to cry, and another just wanted to wake up and find out it had all been a nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was her real life in its rawest form. Fear, panic, and decisions that couldn't be undone later. "Why did they surround you like this? What do they think you did?" she asked Ethan, finally facing the elephant in the room. He went quiet for a few seconds, like someone choosing very carefully which parts of the truth he could reveal without making it all worse. "They think I'm involved in something that should have ended a long time ago," he replied with a bitter half-smile. "And aren't you?" she pushed, needing more than cryptic bits to decide whether to stay or jump out of the car. "I've done a lot of stupid things, Olivia. But tonight, I'm not the one they want to shut up first," he said, finally letting a piece of the truth slip. That sentence blew a hole in her perception. If he wasn't the main target, then who was? Within seconds, her mind flipped through recent memories, conversations, documents, old jobs, like someone frantically opening drawers in a messy room. It's crazy how, when fear hits a certain level, it not only freezes you, but also lights up details you've been ignoring for ages. Maybe that's happened to you. In a moment of crisis, you suddenly remember little signs you brushed off before. The hidden truth, which had been knocking for a while, started hinting that it was much closer than she thought. Outside, the megaphone voice was growing more impatient, harsher, more threatening. And inside, a heavy silence, thick with secrets, filled the cramped taxi like an emotional fog you couldn't see past. Meanwhile, from the police's point of view, everything looked very well laid out on paper, reports, and orders. There was a name, a record, a photo of Ethan stapled to a thick file painting him as way too dangerous to be roaming free. The fear they carried was the fear of losing control of the operation, of letting a marked criminal slip through their fingers. Few of them stopped to wonder if this whole script had been written by people who wanted something else hidden. The hidden truth was that not everyone there was fighting for the same version of justice. That's what makes this scene so powerful. Each person is acting out of a different fear, totally convinced they're right. Olivia feared trusting the wrong person and paying with her life. Ethan feared she'd trust the wrong people and pay with hers. The police, in their own way, were afraid of failing an operation that, for some, was way more about image than truth. Can you see how panic, when shared by several sides, creates a web where everyone moves around blind? If we zoom this out into your own life, you'll see how many decisions are made not based on facts, but on fear and urgency. That's why it's so important to learn to breathe, observe, and ask, who benefits from this version of the story? That one simple question is a powerful key to seeing beyond the surface and getting closer to the hidden truth. Olivia, without knowing it, was about to start asking that kind of question, not out loud, but through the choices she'd make in the next few seconds. And while you follow all this, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? Because no matter the place, one thing is certain: moments like this, where you're forced to choose under pressure, reveal who you really are. From the moment the squad cars finished boxing in the taxi, the whole street turned into a kind of open-air theater. Blue and red lights flickered on the windows, wet asphalt, store signs, painting everything with that color of emergency that makes your chest tighten. People started to gather at the ends of the block, curious faces lit by cell phone screens, filming, zooming in, making guesses. Olivia could see silhouettes moving behind the police tape, like shadows watching a show they didn't fully understand. Up front, Ethan kept his hands tight on the steering wheel, as if letting go would mean everything collapsing at once. Okay, now it got serious, Olivia thought, feeling the fear rise from her stomach to her throat like a wave she couldn't hold back. From that point on, it wasn't just about what she felt, it was about how everyone else would interpret what they were seeing. The panic outside was still controlled, disguised as procedure, code, training. But inside the taxi, it was raw, unedited, a mix of fear and confusion, trying to make sense of the trap closing in around them. That's one of the cruelest things about situations like this. The crowd only sees the surface, never the hidden truth underneath. Have you noticed how easy it is to judge what you see from the outside, without any idea of what's happening inside someone's head? Ali, cercada por sirenes, Olivia estava prestes a virar caso para os outros e virada de chave para ela mesma. And somewhere between the cameras, the police, and Ethan's haunted eyes, the question started to echo inside her. Am I really the one being rescued here? Or am I just part of a story someone needs to sell? The first officer to step closer did it with rehearsed posture. Body slightly turned, weapon ready but pointed down, hand up in a calming gesture. From the outside, it looked like a scene straight out of a negotiation training manual. "Ma'am, my name is Officer Collins. We're here to get you out of this safely, okay?" he said, projecting his voice through the closed window. Olivia heard the words, "get you out," and her chest tightened even more, because now everything inside her was divided. If she believed him blindly, she'd open the door. If she believed Ethan blindly, she'd refuse. And the truth was that trusting blindly was exactly what had dragged her into a lot of bad situations before. Ethan whispered, without taking his eyes off the mirror. "They're not all the same, but some of them are playing for the wrong side tonight." It sounded like paranoia, but something about the way he said it, like someone who'd seen too much, struck a nerve. "Ma'am, are you being threatened? Does he have a weapon?" the officer insisted, raising his voice a little. The scene was almost ready to be edited and aired later. Cop protecting, dangerous driver, trembling victim. You see how fast people jump to fill in the blanks when fear is in the room. If Olivia said just one wrong word, she could condemn Ethan without even understanding what he'd done, or hadn't done, that night. If she said nothing, the police could interpret her silence however they wanted, and panic would do the rest. That's the trap, when fear narrows your options so much that any move feels like a mistake. And right there, squeezed between the dashboard and the back seat, the hidden truth was struggling to be heard through all the noise. The crowd, from a distance, was already narrating the story the way people always do when they only see the outside. "Look, poor girl, she must be dying of fear in there," someone said, filming as if it were a movie and not someone else's life. "Bet he kidnapped her. You can tell by the way he's sitting," another voice added, building a whole plot based on posture and distance. Nobody out there knew about the file she had opened at work, the strange car waiting outside the building, the phone call that had shaken Ethan. But that's how the world works. When people lack information, they fill the gaps with whatever is easiest, usually fear-based assumptions. The panic of the crowd isn't about helping. It's about turning other people's fear into entertainment for a few minutes. Olivia couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but she felt the weight of all those eyes like a physical pressure on her chest. "Right now, everybody thinks they know who I am," she thought, "and none of them have any idea what I actually saw today. Have you ever gone through something that looked one way from the outside, but was completely different from the inside? That's the lonely part of any crisis. No matter how many people are watching, very few truly see you." If you're still here with me, let me remind you, subscribe to the channel and hit like, because stories like this are made to open your eyes, not just to entertain you. The real battle that night wasn't just against guns and sirens. It was against the narrative being built without her consent. And while the world outside chose its roles, hero, villain, victim, Olivia began to question whether she would accept any of those labels. Because deep down, she felt that what was happening there had more to do with hidden truth than with simple rescue. Ethan knew that every second that passed increased the chance of someone out there losing patience. A nervous cop, a misunderstood move, a shouted order at the wrong time. Panic, in moments like this, doesn't need much to turn into tragedy. He took a breath that seemed to come from 10 years ago and said, still looking forward, "Listen to me, very carefully." His voice had a firmness that cut through Olivia's fear, not because it was loud, but because it was honest in its desperation. "Whatever they yell from out there, don't answer on autopilot," he warned. "If you say something they can twist, they will." It sounded like conspiracy, but if there was one thing that night had already taught her, it was that appearances weren't trustworthy. "Why should I believe you more than them?" she shot back, with more courage than she actually felt. "Because you're the one sitting in the middle of the mess I'm already drowning in," he replied. "They go home after this. We don't." That line hit hard because it was true. For the police, it was just another operation. For her and him, it was life-altering. Have you ever realized that sometimes the people most eager to tell your story are the ones with the least to lose? That's why the hidden truth often stays with those who pay the real price. But those are usually the ones nobody wants to hear. Olivia felt her fear and anger mix, forming a weird kind of clarity. No one out there was going to explain the full picture to her. If she wanted to understand what was really at stake, she'd have to listen to every side and still make her own call. And that's terrifying, because it's a lot easier to just pick a hero and cling to whatever they say. But that night, squeezed into that taxi, she didn't have the luxury of being naive anymore. The officer with the megaphone changed his tone. The patience from the manual started giving way to the pressure of real time. "Olivia, we know your name. We know who you are. We're here to protect you," he shouted, sliding her identity into the negotiation. Hearing her name echoed off the walls made her feel even more exposed, like she'd been dragged to the center of a stage she never wanted to step onto. "If you stay in the car with him, it's going to look like you're helping a criminal," the voice continued, now aiming at her fear of judgment. And that was a direct hit. Olivia imagined her face on the news, co-workers whispering, family watching everything without knowing the whole story. Panic isn't just about fear of dying. Often it's about fear of living with a reputation shaded by lies. They're going to use your silence however they want. Either as proof that you're terrified or that you're an accomplice, Ethan murmured. The trap tightened from both sides. If she stepped out blindly, she might be delivered straight into the hands of those who wanted to shut her up. If she stayed, she risked being labeled as someone who chose the wrong side in front of everyone. You know what that's like, at your own scale, when any decision you make seems to come with heavy consequences. It's the kind of crossroads where a lot of people freeze and let others decide for them, just to escape the weight of choosing. But that's also where your story starts to drift away from you and becomes someone else's version of you. Olivia felt, with brutal clarity, that if she didn't take ownership of her story at that moment, she might never get it back. And that realization, despite all the fear, lit a tiny, stubborn spark of courage inside her. Inside that moving prison of metal and glass, time seemed to stretch, but on the clock, only a few minutes had passed. It was enough for the police to set up their positions, for the cameras to start recording, for the crowd to form its opinions. And it was enough for Olivia's inner world to be flipped upside down, along with everything she thought she knew about safety and danger. The panic still pulsed through her veins, but now it had to make room for something else, the urge to understand. Why that street? Why that taxi? Why that file at work? Why that level of force for just one man and one passenger? The more she asked, why, the farther away she got from the role of passive victim that everyone seemed so eager to give her. The officer outside raised the megaphone again, ready for another round of, "Come out, trust us." Ethan tightened his jaw, getting ready to hear his story reduced to a simple label again. And Olivia adjusted her posture in the back seat like someone who, even scared to death, refuses to hand over her voice for free. Have you ever felt that? The moment when fear is huge, but your will to not disappear inside someone else's version of your life is just a little bigger. That's the place where real change begins. Not when you stop feeling fear, but when you stop letting fear speak alone. Out there, the siege tightened more with each second. In here, another kind of pressure was building. The pressure to choose consciously. If this is resonating with you, don't forget to subscribe and like, because stories like this are meant to remind you that your voice matters, even in panic. And when the next words came from the outside, demanding a reaction, Olivia was no longer just a scared passenger. She was someone on the brink of demanding explanations, and that would push the whole story into an even darker and more revealing layer of hidden truth. From the outside, the story was already neatly packaged before anyone even knew Olivia's name. Through the megaphone, the police didn't just give orders. They delivered a ready-made script for everyone on that street to believe. Suspect with a criminal record. Dangerous individual behind the wheel. Passenger in serious risk. Those phrases landed heavy in the air, thick with panic, shaping how every eye, every camera, every whispered comment would interpret the scene. Ethan wasn't just a man in a taxi anymore. He'd been promoted to the role of villain of the night, without trial, without context, without defense. You know how powerful that is, right? The first version people hear tends to become the truth in their heads. The hidden truth is that whoever speaks first with confidence can turn doubt into fear and fear into certainty, even without showing any proof. Olivia listened to those words from inside the car and felt her own fear start to flip. She had been afraid of him. Now she was afraid of what was being said about him. It's like the whole world had decided who he was, based on a file and a record she'd never seen. And in just a few seconds, the distance between real Ethan and Ethan in the official story became big enough to swallow anyone who wasn't paying attention. To make things worse, the voice on the megaphone had a tone that didn't leave space for doubt. "Olivia, he's done this before. He knows how to manipulate. He knows how to use fear to control people," the officer shouted, as if reading straight off a teleprompter. But that statement hit her in a strange way, because, up until then, Ethan had done the opposite of using fear. Instead of threatening her, he'd begged her to stay calm, begged her to think, begged her not to act on panic. "People like him always hide behind half-truths," the voice insisted. as if trying to overwrite what she herself had seen and heard in the last few minutes. And that's where the internal conflict sharpened. Who was actually dealing in half-truths here? The man in front of her, visibly shaken, exposing his past in pieces, or the polished, amplified speech coming from outside, painting everything in black and white? Have you ever noticed how official language always sounds so round, so clean, even when it hides a mess underneath? The hidden truth rarely shows up in the loudest voice. More often it trembles, hesitates, contradicts itself like any real human being. Olivia didn't have all the facts yet, but she could already feel one thing. They weren't giving her room to think. And when people don't want you to think, what they really want is for you to obey. Detective Mark stepped forward, taking the megaphone like an actor taking center stage. "Olivia, my name is Detective Mark. We know who this man is. We've been investigating him for a long time," he announced, with that trained calm that sounds like certainty. He listed off pieces of Ethan's record: former driver, tied to shady jobs, suspected of working with organized crime, linked, indirectly, to violent operations. None of that was technically a lie. Ethan himself had admitted his past wasn't clean. But the way Mark told it, it sounded like every second she stayed in that car, she was standing next to a ticking bomb ready to go off. He left out all the gray areas, how long ago some of those things had happened, who else was involved, what he'd tried to do since then. The story was simple, digestible, panic-friendly: dangerous man, innocent woman, heroic rescue. Humans love stories like that because they don't require nuance or reflection. And you? Be honest. How many times have you believed something just because it sounded complete and came from the right mouth? The fear that Mark stirred up wasn't just about safety, it was also about reputation. "If you stay with him, Olivia, it's going to look like you're on his side," he implied, without even having to say the words directly. And few things paralyze more than the panic of being seen as something you're not. Meanwhile, inside the taxi, Ethan listened to his own life being summarized in headlines, and each one cut deeper than the last. He knew his past could be used against him. He just hadn't expected it to happen right in front of someone he was trying to protect. "That's the problem with having a dirty record," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "They can take the worst chapter and sell it as the whole book." He didn't try to defend himself by denying what he'd done. In fact, that's what made his presence so uncomfortable for her. If he had said, "It's all lies," she could have dumped him into the classic criminal category and calmed herself through that label. But he didn't. He owned his past and still insisted that night, the danger was coming from somewhere else. Have you ever met someone whose story didn't fit neatly into hero or villain? That's exactly where the hidden truth usually lives, in the messy middle that people prefer to ignore. Olivia felt the ground beneath her beliefs start to crack. Was it really that simple? He bad, they good? Or was she once again in the middle of a story where nobody wanted her to see the whole picture? Fear was still there, loud and buzzing, but now it was fractured. It wasn't all pointed in one direction anymore. And when fear stops having only one enemy, we're forced to start thinking instead of just reacting. From the crowd's point of view, through shaky phones and zoomed-in screens, Ethan was the perfect villain. A man with a tense jaw, gripping the wheel, refusing to get out, with a woman trapped in the back seat. If you mute the scene and just look, it's very easy to believe everything the megaphone says. That's how a lot of injustice stays standing. People only see the surface, never the weight of what's going on underneath. Some of those videos hit social media in real time, each one carrying the caption that the person filming thought made the most sense. Crazy taxi driver holds woman hostage. Police negotiates with dangerous suspect. Nobody wrote, "We're not sure what's going on. Let's wait for the facts." Because panic loves certainty, even if it's built on top of almost no information at all. The fear spreading online wasn't just about that street. It was the fear of chaos, of crime, of the feeling that no one is safe. And that collective fear is very easy to steer toward a single scapegoat. Ethan, for that night, fit that role like a glove, even if the hidden truth was much larger than one man and one car. The more the story spread, the less control Olivia would have over her own image if she didn't speak up. And right there, squeezed between the back seat and the cameras outside, she started to feel something even stronger than fear: indignation. That indignation didn't erase her panic, but it changed the flavor of it. Before, she was afraid only of dying, of being shot, of getting caught in a crossfire she didn't choose. Now, she was also afraid of being turned into a prop in a story that trampled over what she had actually lived that day. She thought about the file at work, about the weird people watching her leave the building, about the feeling of being tracked. None of that appeared in the police's version of events. In their story, she was a blank figure, female victim, adult, scared, rescued, the end, no context, no voice, no past, no doubts, just a symbol in a speech designed to create fear and justify action. And here's something that might punch you in the chest a little. How many times in your life have you accepted being just a symbol in someone else's narrative? The good employee, the quiet one, the difficult one, the dramatic one, the strong one who handles everything. Labels are comfortable for everyone except the person trapped inside them. Olivia realized that if she didn't do something, that night she would become another label in a report she'd never get to read. And that realization gave her something more dangerous than panic, a reason to resist. Right there, in the middle of all that noise, a thought began to crystallize in her mind. If everyone already decided what my story is, maybe the only way out is to tell it myself. While the police's version grew stronger with each second into a clean, controlled narrative, something inside Olivia broke and then reorganized. She was still scared, still shaking, still unsure who exactly she could trust. But she no longer accepted the idea of being just the woman in the taxi with the dangerous driver. That was too small, too shallow, too convenient for people who needed a neat story to calm the public. Her memories, her perceptions, the details she had noticed throughout the day, they were all part of a hidden truth that no megaphone had mentioned. And when you realize your truth is being edited out of the official version, you only have two options. Either you retreat and let them tell it for you, or you find a way to speak even with your voice shaking. Olivia didn't know how yet. No plan, no strategy, just this stubborn certainty that staying silent would also be a kind of death. You've probably felt that before too, knowing that if you don't say something, a piece of who you are gets left behind. If this is hitting home for you, don't forget to subscribe and hit like, because this channel is exactly about that. Using stories to wake up what's asleep inside you. Outside, the police refined their version. Inside, a different version was taking shape. Messier, less pretty, but a lot more honest. And it was from that clash between the polished narrative and the raw, lived one that the next move of that night would be born. From the outside, the only version being shouted was the police's. From the inside, Ethan was sitting on top of another story, uglier, riskier, and a lot harder to sell in a 30-second news clip. When Olivia finally asked, "Okay, what's your version?" It was like she had pulled a pin from a grenade he'd been holding in his chest for years. He stared straight ahead for a few seconds, as if reviewing his entire life in fast forward, trying to decide how much to say. "You really want to know?" he asked, his voice low, rough, with that tired tone of someone who knows that telling the truth can be just as dangerous as lying. She hesitated, but nodded. At that point, not knowing was scarier than hearing something terrible. "Fine," he breathed. "In their version, I'm the dangerous one and you're the victim. In my version, you're the target and I'm the idiot who got in the way." That sentence landed like a punch right in the middle of her confusion. Fear, which had been pointing at him like a spotlight, suddenly spun around and lit up a space she hadn't dared look at yet. Have you noticed how sometimes the scariest thing isn't that someone is lying, but that they're telling you something that makes too much sense? The hidden truth was starting to scratch its way to the surface, and no siren could drown it out anymore. Ethan took a deep breath and continued, choosing words like someone picking up glass shards with bare hands. "You weren't supposed to get in my cab tonight," he said. "There was another car waiting for you. A clean car, a safe one." Olivia felt a chill run down her arms, even before she fully understood what "waiting for you" meant. He explained, in pieces, that after she'd accessed that wrong file at work, her name had started circulating in spaces she didn't even know existed. "That document you opened? The one that shouldn't have been on your desk?" he asked. She nodded slowly, replaying the scene, the gray folder, the red sticker, The anonymous note, the rush to print and send it to legal. Yeah, that wasn't a mistake. It was a test. They wanted to see what you'd do, how the system would react, what trace you'd leave, he said. In other words, she hadn't just randomly stepped into a problem. The problem had been handed to her by design. And the moment she interacted with that file, she stopped being just another employee and became a potential leak. You know what that's like. When someone gives you something that looks like just another task, but deep down it's a trap, a way to test your behavior. The fear she'd felt earlier that day suddenly made a lot more sense in hindsight. It hadn't been paranoia. It had been intuition. From the moment you touched that report, Ethan went on, you entered a game where fear and silence are currency. He explained that people like Ryan, the shadowy figure from his past, didn't leave things to chance. If someone lower down the ladder accessed something they shouldn't, there was a containment protocol. Sometimes it was just a conversation. Sometimes an invitation to leave the company quietly. And sometimes, in more serious situations, an accident, a robbery gone wrong, a mysterious disappearance no one really investigated. They don't need you dead, Ethan said, brutally honest. They need you discredited, afraid, or gone, in that order of preference. In that scenario, the police weren't just the good guys showing up. They were also a really good stage, a big operation, a villain to point at, a scared woman rescued, and just like that, no one would be asking why her name was on any kind of internal list that day. You see the pattern. When a lot of noise erupts in one place, it's usually to keep you from looking somewhere else. Olivia swallowed hard, because now the panic she felt wasn't just of bullets or crossfire, it was fear of being used as a distraction. Why would you care if I'm the target or not? She asked, a mix of suspicion and genuine curiosity. Because I've already been the guy who kept quiet while other people were used and thrown away, he replied. I know what happens when nobody gets in the way. The hidden truth of his version wasn't pretty, but it had something the official story didn't: regret. Ethan told her that, earlier that day, he had seen her leave the company building. He recognized the logo on her badge, a logo that, for him, wasn't just a brand, it was a red flag tied to operations he'd rather forget. I saw the car that was really supposed to pick you up, he said. Black, tinted windows, wrong place to be, just waiting for an app ride. He recognized the posture of the men inside, not the casual, sloppy body language of someone waiting for a friend, but the stiff, alert stance of operators on a mission. When you ignored them and flagged my cab, my heart nearly stopped, he admitted, because from the moment she got into his car, instead of theirs, the script was messed up. And people who live off fear and control hate improvisation. Do you understand what that means? He asked, turning slightly to finally look her in the eyes in the rearview mirror. It means from the moment you sat in my back seat, there were suddenly two variables they couldn't control anymore. You and me. Have you ever felt that you accidentally got in the way of something huge and dark without ever having asked for it? That's the feeling Olivia had right then. A mix of guilt, confusion, and a cold, growing awareness of the size of the mess she was in. The panic of a moment turned into the heavy weight of understanding she'd been walking on thin ice long before that night. From his perspective, the police weren't there by chance. They weren't just answering a call about a suspicious taxi. They were responding fast because someone with influence had pushed the right buttons. Think with me, Ethan said. Since when do this many police cars show up so fast for just a taxi that changed its route? Olivia thought about it and realized he had a point. All the times she'd heard about violence, theft, domestic calls where help took forever, and yet tonight, in minutes, they were surrounded. Operations like this don't come out of nowhere, he continued. They come when someone up there wants to make a point. A neat case, clear villain, emotional victim, good press, institutional image polished. Meanwhile, the hidden truth about who requested what, who signed which contracts, who benefited from all that, would stay locked away. You were going to be the rescued girl in their story, Ethan said. You'd go home with a narrative ready-made for you. Grateful, shaken, silent. That's the most dangerous part. When the system doesn't just ask you to obey, it asks you to be grateful for being manipulated. Have you ever thanked someone for something that, deep down, hurt you, but you only realized it later? That was the future being prepared for her if she simply stepped out and nodded to everything. Hearing Ethan open his heart like that didn't magically turn him into some hero in Olivia's eyes. Her fear of him didn't vanish. It just got more complex. Now, he wasn't just the dangerous driver. He was also someone with blood on his hands, horror in his memories, and a conscience trying, clumsily, to balance the scales. It's uncomfortable to accept that someone who has done wrong can also be the person warning you about a trap. People prefer simple characters, the pure hero, the pure villain. It's easier to manage emotionally. But life, unlike movies, is full of people who are both, who have caused panic and also tried to prevent it. Their version is easier to sell, Ethan said. Mine is harder to prove and harder to swallow. He wasn't asking her to see him as innocent. He was asking her to understand that, at least that night, his panic wasn't about being arrested. It was about what would happen to her if she left that car without understanding the game. The moment you step out, you're no longer just Olivia who works at the company, he warned. You become Olivia who saw what she shouldn't have seen. And, trust me, they have ways of dealing with people like that. The hidden truth about that siege was that it wasn't only aimed at him. It was aimed at controlling what she knew, or could come to know. At the end of his version, the street was still full of sirens, the guns were still pointed, and the police were still saying her name. Objectively, nothing had changed, but inside her, everything had. She wasn't looking only at the obvious risk anymore, the man in front of her with a criminal past. She was also looking at the less visible risk, the polished story outside that left no room for questions. Fear hadn't gone away, panic hadn't either. But now both were divided, pulled between two possible dangers, the one the world pointed at and the one nobody wanted to mention. That's the worst, and also the most revealing, place you can find yourself, with no safe side to lean on, forced to choose based on your own reading of the hidden truth. If you've ever had to choose between two fears, you know how paralyzing that is, and how much it exposes who you really are. Olivia sat there, breathing hard, replaying Ethan's words inside her head and all the scenes from that day. And she realized the question was no longer, who is lying? It had become, which lie are they trying to make me live with? And what truth am I willing to face, no matter the cost? When Olivia said, okay, then tell me everything about this, Ryan, something in Ethan's eyes shifted. Up until that point, he'd been wrestling with the panic of the present. Now, he'd have to open a door to a past he'd spent years trying to keep locked. He drew in a long breath, like someone about to dive into freezing water, knowing there's no way to stay half in, half out. I wasn't born a criminal, Olivia, he started, voice rough and tired in a way that didn't come just from that night. I was born screwed, and when you're born screwed, you learn early that fear can be turned into currency. He told her that, years back, he used to drive for a small taxi fleet that did some extra services at night, rides that never showed up in the system, deliveries nobody logged, people too important to stand in any airport line. At first, he tried to pretend he didn't see it, because when your stomach's empty, survival shouts louder than conscience. You've been there in some way, right? Saying yes to something you knew wasn't right because it felt like the only way out in that moment. That's how the hidden truth creeps in. It never introduces itself as corruption. It shows up dressed as opportunity. It was on one of those nights that he met Ryan, the kind of man who doesn't need to yell for people to feel panic just hearing his name. Ryan was polite, well-dressed, calm voice, easy smile, the exact opposite of the cartoon villain people imagine in their heads. And that's the first lesson buried in this story. Real danger rarely has a scary face. It usually shows up looking sharp and respectable. By the way, if you're catching these layers and don't want to miss the rest, hit subscribe and drop a like. We've still got a lot to peel back. From that first ride, Ethan's life slowly started drifting from, it's wrong, but I can still turn back, toward, now it's way too deep. Ethan told her that, at the beginning, working with Ryan even looked professional enough to not feel like crime. Meetings in nice hotels, discreet appointments, documents passed in pretty folders with corporate logos. No dark alleys, no guns to the head, just contracts, numbers, spreadsheets, bank transfers. That's how big crime really works, Olivia, he said, still staring at the windshield, but clearly talking to her, and to anyone listening to this story. While regular people are afraid of the street thief, Guys in suits use the law itself as a curtain to hide what they're doing. At first, Ethan was just told to drive clients from one place to another. No questions asked, just drive and act like you don't hear anything. But with time, ears pick up, eyes catch details, your mind starts connecting dots, and the hidden truth slowly draws itself on the inside of your skull. He heard names of politicians, business owners, cops, judges, mixed together in conversations that were never meant to leave that back seat. At first, fear kept him from trying to understand, because understanding meant admitting he was part of something way above his pay grade. But you can't unhear certain things, and soon his panic wasn't just about getting arrested, it was about being removed by the very system he was working inside. You know that feeling? When you realize the biggest danger isn't someone discovering from the outside, it's the insiders deciding you're no longer useful. That's when Ethan began, almost without meaning to, memorizing names, locations, schedules, a survival reflex more than a plan. He didn't realize it yet, but he was building, piece by piece, a living archive of the rot that held up a lot of respectable people. Olivia listened and quietly started connecting some of this with scandals she'd seen on the news, cases that ended with no one was ever punished. And if you think about your own city, how many normal days are held up by a ceiling full of hidden truths like this? With time, the job stopped being just pick up and drop off and started including more delicate missions. One night, Ethan said, Ryan told me to pick up a suitcase at one address and drop it at another. No questions, no opening, no nothing. He knew that when someone insists that much on don't ask, it's because whatever's inside is heavy, morally, if not literally. But he went anyway, because back then, fear of losing his position still spoke louder than any sense of right or wrong. On the paper, there was no regular address, just coordinates and a contact with a code name. He drove to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, was met by armed men, took the suitcase, put it in his trunk, and drove off. The weight of that suitcase wasn't just physical. It felt like every mile pressed harder on his conscience. He didn't open it, but the silence during that ride was the loudest he'd ever known, because the mind fills in the darkness with its worst images. You've felt that, right? Carrying something you don't fully understand, but your heart insists something's very wrong. From that night on, panic didn't just ride in the back, it sat in the passenger seat and turned into a permanent co-driver. Not long after, he heard on the news about an accident involving someone he'd seen at that warehouse, on that same route. That's when the rock finally dropped. He wasn't just a driver. He was a functioning piece in a chain of decisions that ended in death. At that point, my fear flipped, he admitted. I stopped being afraid of the police and started being afraid of myself. The hidden truth he didn't want to face was this. On some level, he'd known for a while that he'd crossed a serious line. And when a person crashes into that realization, two things can happen. They sink for good, or they start, clumsily, trying to change sides. Ethan chose the second option, not because he'd suddenly become a saint, but because he realized if he didn't, he'd end up like a lot of people he'd seen vanish. He started slowly, first keeping mental copies, then physical ones, times, plates, locations, bits of conversations. Bought an old, basic cell phone just to hide in the car and secretly record audio during special rides. I know it sounds like a movie, but it was pure desperation, he said, with a sad little smile. I had nowhere to run, so I started building a kind of life insurance out of information. On every shady trip, he recorded something, a stray sentence, a name, a phone number, a reference to shady contracts. Can you see how sometimes it's guilt itself that pushes someone to gather evidence against the very system they're part of? That secret archive became Ethan's cursed treasure, useful for protection, but dangerous just to exist. He knew that if Ryan ever found out, his ending would be fast and silent, with no chance to explain anything. But he also knew that, without that leverage, any attempt to leave would just look like a worthless betrayal. Here's something you should remember. Whoever controls fear controls the game, and whoever holds the hidden truth starts to rebalance that power. After a few years of this, with a ridiculous amount of compromising material piled up, Ethan decided to do the unthinkable. Reach out to people on the outside, not for heroism, but because the panic of dying as a disposable pawn finally got bigger than the fear of going to jail. And that's when he made the most dangerous mistake of his life, trusting the wrong people to handle the truth he had collected. "I went to a cop," he said, and the way he said just that one sentence already carried enough regret to fill that whole taxi. Not just any officer, one known as honest, hardline, famous for not being on anyone's payroll. It seemed logical. If anyone could use that proof to bring down Ryan and the others, it would be this guy. They met quietly. Ethan brought part of the audio recordings, showed lists with dates and locations, laid out the whole thing more honestly than he ever had with anyone. At first, the cop seemed shocked, then interested, then suspiciously technical and cold. He listened, took the files, promised to schedule a meeting with the DA, talked about protection, about deals, about cooperation, Ethan recalled. But a few days later, long before any official action took place, he started noticing unfamiliar cars circling his house, masking number calls, blocked routes by police cruisers that were supposedly on another operation. His fear stopped being a vague idea and turned into something physical, real panic about being erased before any justice even had a chance. "That's when I realized my file hadn't gone to justice," he said flatly. "It had gone onto the shelf of someone who had the most to gain from it, someone on the inside. Have you ever imagined what it's like to realize the person you chose to save you is part of the same dirty game you wanted to expose? That's one of the worst hidden truths someone can face, discovering that the lifeboat is made of the same rot as the ship." From that point on, Ethan stopped being just a guilty accomplice with remorse and became a potential target, someone who knew too much, and that status, walking target, is precisely what put him in that taxi on that night, with Olivia in the back seat. Olivia listened, horrified, but also sharper. At the same time, she was disgusted by some of what Ethan had done. She also started to understand why that night's siege felt so personalized. He wasn't just some ex-driver who got mixed up with bad people. He was a man carrying a live archive of secrets that could take down some very big names. After that, I disappeared for a while, changed cities, changed my name, changed my routine, he said. Went back to driving a taxi, but this time trying to be just another face in the crowd. No special rides, no weird conversations, no heavy suitcases. But the hidden truth is that people who've been part of that level of game rarely just disappear for good. At some point, someone spots a trail, a face, a pattern, and the game quietly restarts. When I saw you coming out of that building today, I recognized the company logo on your badge, and the panic I felt wasn't for me. It was for you, he said again. Olivia remembered that odd feeling she'd had earlier that day, at the office doors, like there were too many eyes on her all at once. You've had that too, right? That creeping sense you're being watched even though there's no obvious proof. She started realizing that nothing about that night was random. Not the car waiting in front of her building, not Ethan's cab showing up so fast, not how efficient the police response was. Every piece pointed to something bigger, a story where fear and panic were tools used to drive everyone toward a convenient outcome. By the way, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from while we unpack all of this? Because whatever your city is, don't think for a second it doesn't carry its own distance between what's shown and the hidden truth in backstage rooms. Olivia, now, no longer saw Ethan as just the dangerous taxi driver, but as a man scarred by a system she was only just beginning to see. By the end of that account, the silence inside the taxi was so heavy it felt like a third person sitting between them. Outside, the police were still shouting, repeating the same lines about dangerous criminal and woman at risk. But inside, risk now had a whole different shape, way more complex than the simple label blaring through the speakers. Olivia's fear was moving again, changing addresses, from the idea of one scary man in front of her to something much bigger, a whole web she'd stepped into without wanting to. This is one of the scariest experiences a person can have, finding out that the real danger isn't just someone, it's an entire system. She wiped her face, trying to organize her thoughts, and the only thing she managed to say was, "If all of this is true, then why me?" That question echoed inside the car like the next inevitable step of that conversation. Because until that moment, Ethan had talked a lot about Ryan, about the system, about corrupt cops, but her part in the story was still blurry. You see how every story has a point where it stops being about others and becomes very directly about you? That's the moment when fear leaves the news headlines and sits in your passenger seat. Ethan looked at her with a mix of compassion and gravity, knowing the next part would hit even harder. There's one detail about you in this whole story, something you did without realizing, he said, preparing the ground. The hidden truth of that night wasn't only in his past, but in one small thing she had done hours earlier that seemed completely harmless. And it's exactly in that small, insignificant detail that the next big twist of this story was waiting. When Ethan said that everything started with one silly little thing you did, Olivia felt her stomach twist. He explained it wasn't some grand decision, not a movie moment, but one of those things we do on autopilot. You don't even realize you changed your own fate this morning, he added, glancing quickly at her in the rearview mirror. Her mind raced through the whole day, trying to find something that looked important enough to justify that much panic. She thought about the rush at the office, the late emails, the meeting she almost missed, the boss pacing around, irritated. Remember that document that wasn't supposed to be on your desk, but showed up there out of nowhere? He asked, locking eyes with her. Right then, an image hit hard. A gray folder, a red sticker on it, left on top of her desk with a simple little note. Urgent. Print and send to legal today. No signature, nothing special, like just another piece of corporate bureaucracy. She'd felt a small discomfort when she opened that heavy file full of numbers, company names, clauses that sounded like another language. But the fear of looking incompetent spoke louder than her intuition, so she just did what she was told and kept going. She didn't know that was one of those moments where the hidden truth passes right in front of you, and you choose, without knowing, whether to look or look away. You didn't just open the file, Olivia, Ethan said calmly. You interacted with it in a way the company's security system didn't expect. And that's when her fear, up to now focused on the sirens and guns, began turning toward the keyboard she'd used just hours before. Because, without realizing it, she had made the exact move that would put her name on the list of problematic people for whoever runs things at the top. When she closed her eyes for a second, she could see herself that morning, sitting in front of that too-bright screen. She remembered the blinking cursor, the software freezing, the tight deadline, the boss messaging her, "Is it done yet?" On top of that, the system asked for a second authentication, something she didn't usually see for everyday files. That was already a warning, Ethan explained, but you were too busy fighting the clock to notice the system itself was scared. Olivia had tried to understand a few lines of the report and, not getting it, snapped a quick photo of the screen with her phone. She didn't mean harm. It was just for later, like everyone does when they think they'll need to remember something important. That blurred photo, with a chunk of text and numbers, was exactly the kind of thing that should never exist outside that computer. Their security obsession is control, Ethan said, and any trace outside the system turns into pure panic for the guys upstairs. The system logged that someone with her profile accessed that file, stayed on it longer than usual, touched sensitive fields. Some algorithm in some server then linked that to the fact that she connected her phone to the corporate Wi-Fi a few minutes later. That innocent little click to save a reminder turned into a silent scream to the system. Something is escaping. The hidden truth is this. In environments like that, nobody needs to see you steal anything. You just need to look like you could. To them, you stopped being a person and became a risk, Ethan said bluntly. And once someone is classified as a risk, the game changes scale and speed without asking your permission. Before she even had time to process any of it, people she'd never met were already making decisions about her life without knowing the first thing about her. Ethan then connected a dot that until that night existed only as a vague, nagging feeling in her memory. Remember that black car across the street when you left the building? He asked. She remembered it clearly. 2 men in suits, no visible badges, pretending to be on their phones, but their posture didn't look like any Uber driver she'd seen. Her brain had thrown that into the "I'll think about this later" drawer, the one where we stuff everything that scares us. They weren't there by accident, Ethan said. They were there to see who this employee who clicked where she shouldn't really was. The goal wasn't to scare her yet, it was to observe, learn her routine, figure out if she was the type to talk too much or swallow her fear. But when she got into Ethan's taxi, slipping out of the route they had planned for her, things went a little off script. "You don't know this, but another car was supposed to pick you up tonight," he said, and a chill ran down her spine. It was supposed to be a friendly ride, offered by someone from work, or a manipulated rideshare, something that looked perfectly normal. But in her hurry, she just raised her hand in the street like always, and fate threw Ethan into her path. The panic flipped sides. The watchers saw their piece leave the board and move to a space they didn't control. "That's when everything sped up," he said. "People who live off secrets don't handle surprises well. The hidden truth is that systems of power love things predictable. When someone escapes the pattern, their fear becomes fast action. That's why the siege that night was so quick, so efficient, so over the top for just a taxi on a quiet street. It wasn't only about his past. It was about the fact that she was now carrying, without knowing, an image on her phone worth a lot more than her yearly salary. If you look closely at that situation, you can see something that applies way beyond this taxi and these sirens. How many times has one small action you thought was harmless ended up having a huge impact you only saw later? A message sent impulsively, a contract signed without reading, a conversation overheard and brushed aside. Today's world is made of traces, clicks, photos, audio, location. Everything turns into data, and data turns into power in the hands of those who know how to use it. Most people live like none of that matters, and that's where the hidden truth slips right past them unnoticed. The fear you feel when something goes wrong doesn't come from nowhere. It's often the result of small choices you were never taught to examine. Ethan, with his voice still shaky, had turned into a kind of accidental mentor in that front seat. "I'm not saying this is your fault," he told her. "I'm saying they count on your lack of information to keep their game running. People like that need you to feel panic at the wrong time and blind trust at the time you should be suspicious. That's why it's so important to develop an eye for details, weird patterns, that feeling that something is just off. And honestly, that's why I keep reminding you, subscribe to the channel, because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're training. Hit like if this is making sense to you, because that tells me to keep bringing narratives with layers like this. The difference between surviving the system or being swallowed by it often sits in your ability to question what looks normal. Olivia was learning this the hard way, right in the middle of her worst night, while her life was being decided without a single meeting invite. You, on the other hand, can choose to learn it now, listening, so you don't have to wait for your life to turn into a crime scene to start paying attention. Inside the taxi, the realization hit Olivia in a way that hurt. She realized she wasn't just the victim of a bad luck night. She was the main character in a story that had been building up for a while. Her panic wasn't just about stray bullets or being used as a human shield in a police standoff. It was a deeper, harsher fear that she had been used as a disposable piece by people who didn't even know her last name. Her hands shook, not only because of what was happening outside, but because of the memory of that photo on her phone. If I had deleted it, if I had ignored it, if I had asked more questions, her mind started spinning. But replaying the what-ifs wouldn't change the fact that she was sitting there, surrounded, with the hidden truth literally in her pocket. Ethan saw the guilt creeping in and cut it off. "This isn't about blaming you. It's about a system built so information is worth more than people." That hit deep, because it was the first time that night someone seemed to care about how she felt, not just what she represented. And you know what's curious? While all this was unfolding, people outside were recording, commenting, judging without knowing any of it. Same thing happens with you. A lot of people talk about your life without any idea of your backstage, your context. You know what's curious? While all this was unfolding, people outside were recording, commenting, judging without knowing any of it. Same thing happens with you. A lot of people talk about your life without any idea of your backstage, your context, your hidden truth. By the way, drop a comment and tell me, from which city are you watching this story stuffed with fear and twists? Because wherever you are, there's always that gap between what the world sees and what really goes on inside your internal taxi. Olivia took a deep breath, swallowed the tears threatening to spill, and started to feel something new rising alongside her fear: anger. And when fear walks hand in hand with anger, a different kind of courage is born. Quiet, but very dangerous to those who live off manipulation. Outside, the tone of the operation shifted again, like someone had decided it was time to tweak the strategy. The megaphone, which had sounded aggressive before, softened, and a new voice began to speak, calmer and more controlled. It was Detective Mark himself now, stepping into the role not just of authority, but of friend in the story. "Olivia, we just want to get you out of there safely. Nobody wants to hurt you," he said, like he had a script in his head. His words came wrapped in a gentle tone, but it was a manufactured gentleness, the kind that leaves a strange aftertaste. Inside, Olivia heard with new ears. She wasn't the same woman who, a little while ago, would have swallowed any authoritative phrase unquestioned. She knew she had, in her phone, a piece of the hidden truth, and that made her something more than a victim. It made her an unwanted witness. Ethan leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "This is the moment you decide how you're going to use your fear, to surrender or to negotiate. You've got something they want to control, even if they don't know it's on your phone yet," he said, nodding toward her pocket. Her panic surged again, but mixed with that growing indignation, it started to turn into focus. For the first time since the night began, she thought about doing something beyond just reacting, asking, demanding, negotiating. And that's a crucial shift, because when someone chooses to negotiate with awareness, the ground under whoever thought they controlled the script starts to shake. Mark took a few steps forward outside, like an actor walking into the most important scene of a play. He had no idea that the terrified passenger he imagined inside the taxi had just realized she could be more than a prop in his story. And it's exactly in the collision between the negotiator's soft voice and Olivia's new internal stance that the next chapter of that night opens. The negotiation that could save or destroy everyone involved. Outside, Mark walked a few steps closer to the taxi, like someone approaching a cage with the lion still wide awake inside. He lifted the megaphone, but this time he didn't shout. He spoke in a lower, controlled, almost fatherly tone. "Olivia, my name is Mark. I'm here to help you, okay?" he started, like someone calling customer service for her life. The intention was clear. Swap raw panic for a sense of fake safety, because people who are less afraid obey more easily. Inside, Olivia felt her body react, not because she trusted him, but because her mind had been trained her whole life to respect a voice of authority. Up front, Ethan, listening closely, muttered, "Pay attention to the words he uses, not just the tone." That's where the hidden truth slips through. Mark kept going, talking about family, future, protection, painting a picture where getting out of the car seemed like the only sensible choice. "You didn't do anything wrong, Olivia. You're the victim here, but you have to cooperate if you want to walk out of this alive," he said, weighing each syllable. Her fear was being pulled from one side by the promise of protection and from the other by the secrets she now knew about Ethan's past. And it's right on this emotional tightrope that a lot of people fall. Between the fear of dying and the fear of being lied to, the winner is usually whoever sounds prettier. By the way, before this conversation really heats up, let me remind you to subscribe to the channel and hit like if this story has you hooked. It tells the algorithm you enjoy this kind of narrative that mixes suspense, reflection, and hidden truth. Because what's happening in that taxi isn't just a police scene. It's a live masterclass on how fear can be used as a tool. Olivia took a deep breath and decided she wouldn't let anybody negotiate her life without her asking a few questions first. From that moment on, the negotiation wouldn't just be between police and suspect, it would also be between the new Olivia and the old one who used to obey in silence. She looked forward and felt the panic pounding in her chest like a badly tuned drum. But even so, she opened her mouth. "Detective Mark," she called out, loud enough for her voice to cut through the glass. "What exactly are you accusing Ethan of today, not in the past?" There was a small pause outside, that tiny gap in time when someone has to invent a convincing answer faster than they can think. "He's dangerous, Olivia. He's got a long history, and right now he's keeping you in there against your will," Mark replied, still avoiding details. Ethan almost laughed, a nervous, bitter laugh, because it was basically the opposite. He'd been begging her to stay so she wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. "Ask them what proof they have that I'm a risk to you right now," he whispered, even lower, guiding each step. She followed his suggestion. "What evidence do you have that, today, he's trying to hurt me and not protect me?" Outside, Mark's posture shifted slightly, like that question hadn't been in the script he'd prepared. He let out a vague, "Look, Olivia, we have internal information, investigations. I can't give you all the details right now," and dodged the specifics. "Here's a golden rule for you to keep. When someone uses fear to convince you but can't be specific, turn your alarm on. Most manipulation feeds on vague phrases said in a tone of urgency, exactly like that night, surrounded by sirens. The hidden truth almost never comes wrapped in, 'Trust me, I know things.' It comes with data, context, commas, and question marks." Olivia sensed that, not because she was an expert, but because her fear was now mixed with a new clarity. "If you can't explain, how do you expect me to trust you?" she replied. And that line wasn't just for them, it was for her whole life. Outside, some officers exchanged looks, uncomfortable, realizing they weren't dealing with just another panicked hostage easy to handle. Mark tried to recalibrate, shifting the negotiation to a more emotional, almost intimate tone. "Olivia, I know you're scared. I know it feels like everyone's against you, but we're on your side," he insisted. He used her name constantly, trying to build closeness, to create an artificial emotional bridge. "This guy in there has fooled a lot of people. He knows how to use hidden truth to his advantage. You're just one more on the list," he added. Ironically, without realizing it, he hit the word that best summarized that night: truth. But inside the car, Olivia was starting to feel that nobody owned it. Not the taxi driver, not the badge, not the megaphone. "If you're really on my side, why can't you tell me what my role is in all this?" she shot back, louder. The question dropped like a rock, because until then, their entire speech revolved around Ethan, his past, his crimes. At no point had Mark clearly explained why she was so important. It justified that whole circus. "Have you noticed how, when someone wants to use you, they talk a lot about other people's mistakes, but almost nothing about what they actually want from you? It's always the same pattern: directed panic, exaggerated fear, tons of context about one side and almost zero about the other. The hidden truth usually lives exactly where nobody wants to go into detail, because that's where the real interests are hiding." Mark cleared his throat, swallowing irritation, and tried to escape through the back door. "Your role is to stay alive, Olivia. That's all that matters right now." But she was no longer buying pretty, empty phrases, not after everything she'd heard from Ethan about contaminated systems. And little by little, the negotiation stopped being, "Take the hostage out, put the suspect down," and turned into a subtle battle for her trust. Seeing Olivia getting stronger in the middle of her fear, Ethan decided to take a slightly bigger risk. "Tell them you want a lawyer present before you get out of the car," he suggested, knowing that would tighten the rope. She swallowed hard, because asking for a lawyer in that scenario felt like defying more than just the police. It felt like going against the entire script everyone expected her to follow. "Even so," she repeated it, "I'll only come out of here if there's an independent lawyer present, not someone on your team." There was immediate murmuring around the patrol cars, crackling radios, hands making worried gestures, like that request had just turned into a logistical nightmare. Mark tried to hide the discomfort behind a smile no one could really see in the dark. "Olivia, you're mixing things up. This is an emergency situation." "Exactly," she replied. "An emergency is the perfect setting to hide things, and I've seen too much hidden truth already tonight." That answer didn't just appear out of nowhere. It came from a mix of panic, information, and a sudden refusal to be treated like a disposable piece. Can you see how fear can either freeze you or push you into a new kind of courage when you decide you're done being fooled? A lot of people only find that strength on the edge of the cliff, when they realize that obeying blindly doesn't guarantee safety at all. "If you're so sure about your version, a lawyer shouldn't be a problem," she finished, almost as a challenge. A few long seconds of silence followed, the kind of silence where important decisions are made in whispers. Out there, Mark started negotiating not only with Olivia, but with the limits of the theater he could hold up in public. Because the more thinking people you have inside a siege, the harder it gets to use fear as the only argument. And that was what was really bothering them. That passenger, supposedly in panic, had stopped reacting on autopilot. As tension increased, Olivia felt her phone vibrate faintly in her pocket, like some impatient secret begging to be let out. She instinctively reached for it, but Ethan quickly stopped her with a serious look. "Wait," he said. "Before you answer anything, think, who'd have the guts to call you right now? That detail matters. In moments of panic, the impulse is to answer everything, reply to everything, do anything that looks like a solution. But that's exactly when most traps get set, because fear wants immediate action, not thoughtful choices. It could be someone from the company, could be someone from out there, could even be them testing you," Ethan continued, fighting his own anxiety. Outside, Mark noticed the small movement and raised his voice. "Olivia, don't talk to anyone except the police. You could be manipulated." The irony was brutal. He was accusing others of doing exactly what he'd been trying to do the entire time, using fear as his main argument. The hidden truth was that, in that moment, everyone there was terrified of losing control over her story. You've probably lived a smaller version of this, when two people tell completely different stories and both swear they're the only ones who want what's best for you. It's confusing. It triggers panic. It makes you want to shut down and walk away. But it's also the perfect time to decide you won't be anybody's pawn. Olivia felt the weight of that phone in her pocket, full of data, memory, and now, risk. She didn't answer right away. For the first time that night, she chose to pause and observe instead of reacting. And it was that pause, that half-second of awareness, that changed how the next step of the negotiation would play out. Because what was coming next wasn't just the police talking to a hostage, it was a third voice entering the scene, from the other end of that call. To anyone watching everything through a screen, it probably looked like just another tense negotiation, with dramatic lines from both sides. But in Olivia's mind, that was a kind of final test between her old self, guided solely by fear, and the new self, guided by intelligent doubt. Before that night, she probably would have left the taxi in the first 5 minutes, trusting the uniform and the megaphone without a second thought. Now, with her head spinning full of information, she understood that panic is the worst time to hand your fate over to strangers. That's why I keep insisting. This isn't just a story about a taxi and the police. It's a mirror of how you handle fear in your own life. How many times have you accepted a proposal, a relationship, an important decision just because someone spoke with urgency and confidence? How many hidden truths have you ignored because you were too tired, too scared, too alone to question what didn't add up? Olivia was tired. She was scared. She was surrounded. But still, she chose to ask, to negotiate, to demand clarity. That didn't magically protect her from harm, but it did protect her from something more subtle and devastating, becoming just an extra in her own story. By the way, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? I'm asking because wherever you are, you know exactly what it feels like to be pushed from all sides by forces bigger than you. And if this narrative is helping you see a little deeper, don't forget to subscribe and hit like. That's how I know that this kind of content, mixing suspense, panic, fear, and the search for hidden truth, makes sense to you. Meanwhile, on that street flooded with squad cars, Olivia braced herself to face not just the police, but the voice waiting on the other side of that mysterious call. Inside the taxi, the sound of sirens had already become part of the air, like a constant noise glued to their skin. Olivia could still feel her own phone vibrating in her pocket, like an impatient secret asking to be let out. She hesitated, torn between the fear of answering and the fear of ignoring someone who might actually help. Before she could decide, another sound sliced through the cramped space. Ethan's phone started ringing. It was an old, sharp ringtone, simple and out of fashion, and that made it stand out even more. He glanced at the screen, and whatever color was left in his face drained in an instant. The number showed up as restricted. No name, no area code, no clue, just a blank label full of threat. Olivia picked up on it right away. This was not the kind of call you ignore without consequences. The panic in his eyes was clearer than the flashing red and blue lights reflecting in the glass. "It's him," Ethan muttered, as if the name didn't even need to be spoken. "Him who?" Olivia asked, still not realizing she was about to hear the voice behind a good part of the fear running that night. Outside, the shouting continued, commands echoing, cops taking position, no one imagining that another negotiation was about to start inside the car. A quieter one, dirtier, the kind that never shows up in a report because it carries too much hidden truth. And hey, if you're still here feeling this tension with them, go ahead and subscribe and hit like so you don't miss where this story goes next. Because what's about to be said on this call explains why so much panic was staged around a simple taxi that night. Ethan answered without putting it on speaker, but the voice on the other end was so low and sharp that Olivia could still catch fragments. "You know you shouldn't have gotten in our way again," the man said, not angry, just cold, calculated. It wasn't the voice of someone who screams. It was the voice of someone used to commanding people ruled by fear. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to keep his own panic under control. "I'm just driving. That's all," he whispered back. The short laugh on the other end had zero humor. It sounded more like someone amused by a child's bad lie. "You never just drive, Ethan. You always see too much," the voice replied, pressing exactly on the guilt he carried. Olivia felt a chill, even without knowing the full story, because that conversation carried a threat you didn't need details to understand. The hidden truth was simple. Whoever was on the other end knew exactly who Ethan was, where he was, and who was with him. "The cops outside aren't there by accident," the man went on, almost bored. "They're helping clean up a mess you started when you decided it was a good idea to record important people." It was like someone had pulled back the curtain and showed a stage where everyone pretended they didn't know the script. Ethan squeezed the phone so tight his knuckles went white, and Olivia realized his fear now wasn't just for himself, it was for her. You ever felt that? That sense that your name is being tossed around in conversations you're not in? Used in games that aren't yours? That's a different kind of panic, one that doesn't explode. It eats at you from the inside while the hidden truth creeps closer. And even though she wasn't on the call, Olivia could feel she was suddenly the main topic between those two voices. "You picked the wrong person tonight," the man said, and those words made Olivia's stomach twist even without context. Ethan shut his eyes for a second, like someone taking a hit but refusing to go down. "I didn't pick anyone. She flagged the taxi like any other passenger," he answered, trying hard to sound firm. "That's exactly what makes this so irritating," the voice replied, now with a hint of impatience. "She was supposed to be in another car, on another route, with other people handling this in a quieter way." Even without understanding everything, Olivia felt it. This night had been planned with her in mind, and she hadn't been told. She wasn't a random passenger. She was a route error, and people who live off control go into panic when the route changes on them. "You complicated everything, Ethan," the man added. "You still have that childish habit of thinking you can save people." The line hit deep because it was true. His fear hadn't stopped him from trying to protect her from the beginning. The hidden truth in that accusation was that Ryan saw empathy as a weakness, not a virtue. "You know what happens to people who get in the way, don't you?" the voice added, now letting the poison drip visibly. Ethan's breath shortened, and Olivia noticed a cold sweat sliding down his neck despite the stale air in the car. Outside, no one heard any of this. To them, it was still just the cops versus the dangerous taxi driver. But that's how it goes in real life too. While the world reacts to headlines, the real negotiation happens in quiet, encrypted conversations. And it's in those conversations that fear is calibrated, panic is manufactured, and history is written in favor of whoever controls information. Ethan knew that if he stayed only on the defensive, he'd be crushed under that man's pressure. So somewhere between fear and courage, he played the only card he had left, the existence of the proof he'd never fully handed over. "You know I didn't give that cop everything, right?" he said, chewing over each word. "If something happens to me here, there are people who will receive things of yours in places you don't even know about." There was a different kind of silence on the other end, not surprised, but calculating, like someone reevaluating the size of a problem. "You're more stubborn than I remember," the voice replied, now with a little less smugness. The hidden truth behind that pause: even the powerful are afraid, especially of traces they don't control. "But you're forgetting something," the man went on, regaining his composure. "You're not the focus tonight." Those words landed like a stone in the middle of the car, and Olivia felt her heart rate spike painfully. No one had drawn a picture for her, but it wasn't hard to connect the dots. There was a main target that night, and it might not be Ethan. You inserted yourself in the middle and now you want to negotiate like you have a choice, the voice sneered. But the person who really interests us is sitting right next to you, thinking she'll just go home and sleep after this. Olivia's mind spun, trying to reject what those words pointed to, but her body reacted first. Cold hands, short breaths, rising panic. Have you ever had that moment when you suddenly realize the story doesn't revolve around who you thought it did? It revolves around you. That's when the hidden truth stops being an abstract concept and becomes something that lands directly on your skin. Olivia couldn't catch every word, but she saw enough in Ethan's eyes to know something terrible had just been said. "What did he say?" she asked, voice shaky, hanging between the fear of the answer and the fear of not knowing. Ethan took a few seconds, like someone sifting through different versions of the truth in his head and losing. He said, "I'm not the real problem tonight," he answered, blunt, because there was no more room for half-truths. "What do you mean, not you?" she insisted, feeling panic flood her body like hot water. "They're worried about what you saw without realizing, about what might be on your phone, in your company's system, in your memory," he explained. The words felt surreal. Just hours ago, she was only another office worker trying to survive a long day. Now she was discovering she was walking around carrying an invisible bomb made of data, images and digital trails that had become dangerous. That's the hidden truth of the modern world. You can be dangerous to someone just because you're capable of proving what they did. You don't have to be a hero or an activist. You just have to be in the wrong place at the right time with the wrong file open. "Then why is the police talking only about you?" Olivia asked, still trying to find logic in that chaos. "Because it's easier to make everyone feel panic about a dangerous taxi driver than to admit they're really hunting a regular employee," Ethan replied. "You see how the narrative shifts so attention goes where it's most convenient, while the hidden truth stays in the dark? And just like I asked before, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? Because wherever you are, this game of polished story versus buried truth is happening all the time. If this is making sense to you, hit subscribe and leave a like so I know you want to follow this story all the way to the end." On the phone, the man decided to wrap things up with a suggestion that wasn't a suggestion at all. It was a threat. "You don't have much time, Ethan," he said, sounding as relaxed as someone watching the end of a game they think they've already won. "Hand the girl over, and maybe someone there walks away breathing." The word "hand over" made Olivia shiver, because it clearly showed that to this man, she wasn't a person. She was an object of exchange. Ethan bit his lip, holding in rage and fear at the same time, and answered, "You know that. As long as it depends on me, that's not going to happen." A dry laugh came from the other end, dripping with contempt. "Since when do you run anything? Remember who controls the police out there, who controls the panic that's on TV right now, who controls the truth people will hear tomorrow." And that line is a brutal summary of the game. Whoever controls fear controls the narrative. Whoever controls the narrative controls the official version of the hidden truth. The call dropped right after, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence inside the taxi, while outside, the noise only grew. Olivia felt her legs weak, even though she was sitting. Now she knew with horrifying clarity that the main target that night had a name and a face, hers. It wasn't a suspicion anymore, or a nightmare fed by panic. It was information, dry, direct, merciless. "Try to convince you I'm the problem just to get you away from me," Ethan said, turning to her. "Because once you're away, you're easier to mold, to manipulate, to erase if needed," he added. Right there, her fear stopped being just a desperate urge to escape and turned into an urgent need to figure out how to protect herself in a rigged game. And it's exactly at this point, when she finally understands she is the target, that the night takes an even more brutal turn. If you want to follow that turn, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on, because the next step is where panic, fear, and the hidden truth collide head-on. When the call dropped, the silence inside the taxi was louder than all the sirens outside put together. Olivia looked at Ethan, And for the first time, she didn't just see a taxi driver in panic or a guy with a shady past. She saw someone who knew way too much about the kind of people who treat human lives like chess pieces. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like each beat was a punch from the inside out, mixing fear, anger, and disbelief. "So that's it," she whispered, almost to herself. "You're not really the one they're after." Saying it out loud gave the hidden truth weight, shape, smell, like it had been there the whole time just waiting to be named. Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes worn out, like a man who'd read this script long before the first siren wailed. "I'm the perfect excuse," he said. "A face they can dump all the panic on while they deal with the real problem. You." That sentence hit Olivia like an electric shock, smashing the illusion that getting out of the car would automatically mean safety. Have you ever thought you were just watching a problem from the outside, and suddenly realized you were the target the whole time? It's a feeling that mixes fear with a strange kind of awakening, like someone yanks the rug out and, for the first time, you actually see the floor. In that moment, Olivia understood she wasn't choosing between dangerous driver and protective police. She was at the center of a fight between people who wanted to use her fear and someone who, in his own messed up way, was trying to put her one step ahead of the panic. And before I go further, let me ask you, if this story is hitting you in a different way, subscribe to the channel and hit like, because understanding how hidden truth hides in the middle of fear can seriously change how you look at a lot of things in your own life. Outside, the scene stayed the same. Squad cars, cones, tape, flashing lights, curious people filming on their phones. From far away, the narrative was irresistible. A criminal at the wheel, a terrified woman in the back. Nobody imagined that the biggest danger wasn't the man being surrounded, but the woman everybody claimed they wanted to save. That's the cruel irony in a lot of real stories. The real target isn't who it looks like. It's the one nobody bothers to look at twice. Ethan tried to explain that as clearly as the panic would let him. "They know you had access to something you shouldn't have, even if it was just for a few minutes," he said. "Even if you don't understand what was in that file, just being able to recognize a name, a clause, a sequence of numbers is already a problem." In her mind, flashes of that report came back like broken scenes from a nightmare. Logos, codes, legal jargon. Until that day, it all looked like boring paperwork. Now, every line carried a new shadow. Have you ever realized, only much later, that something ordinary actually had huge weight you didn't see at the time? That delay between the event and the realization is what feeds so much panic, because you feel like you're always late to your own story. Olivia slipped a hand into her pocket, feeling the phone like it was burning, knowing it held more than just notifications. Inside it, maybe, was the trigger for the entire night, the proof of what she had seen without knowing she was seeing it, and at the same time, maybe it was the key to flipping the game, if she didn't let fear push her into a rash decision. Meanwhile, Mark kept playing his part outside with almost perfect timing. "Olivia, we get that you're confused, that you're scared, but you need to come out of there now," he repeated. Only now, each sentence came with a different subtitle for her, like an invisible caption under every official line. When he said, "Come out of there," she heard, "Step away from the only protection you still have, even if that protection was fragile and temporary." When he said, "We want to protect you," she thought, "Protect me from who exactly? And more importantly, why is nobody willing to talk openly about what I saw at that company today?" You notice this. The most dangerous kind of fear isn't the one that screams hate. It's the one wrapped in concern for your safety. "If you stay in there with him, it's going to look like you're helping," Mark added, pulling the trigger of her social panic. That's the point where a lot of people cave in, when the fear of being judged outweighs even the fear of physical harm. Olivia pictured her face on screens, on sites, in comment sections full of hate, and felt the panic almost win. But then she remembered Ethan's line, "Whoever controls the narrative controls the fear." And something inside whispered, "If I step out without understanding everything, I'm not just saving myself. I'm handing my story to the wrong people." The hidden truth had grown too big to pretend she knew nothing, even if that made the danger feel more real. And for the first time, she started seeing more value in being conscious and at risk than in being ignorant and safe. Ethan, sensing the war going on inside her, shifted his approach. He stopped talking like an accused man and started talking like someone who, despite the fear, had something of a mentor inside that chaos. "Think about one thing," he said, looking at her through the mirror. "If I were actually the monster they're painting, I'd already have used you as a shield. I'd already be threatening you, already forcing you to do something. I'd have locked the doors, grabbed you, done all the stuff they expect a desperate guy to do. Instead, all he'd done so far was beg her to stay in the car, explain, ask her to think. No aggressive hands, no weapon, no invasive touch, just a man clearly terrified, trying to inject context into a night built on panic. Now think about the other side," he went on, his voice still shaky but focused. "You've got people outside yelling for you to come out, without giving you the full story, without telling you how this all started, just pulling you to their side by force. Have you noticed how the loudest voices aren't always the ones who know more? They're often just the ones most afraid of losing control." Olivia looked at him, and despite everything she knew about his past, couldn't ignore the brutal logic in his words. Her fear didn't go away. Neither did the panic. But now there was a third element in the mix: discernment. And once discernment shows up, the hidden truth starts to move, begging to be seen. Of course, none of this turned Olivia into some instant heroine, fearless and unshakable. She was still scared, still on the verge of tears, still wanting to wake up in her bed and pretend none of this had ever happened. But she was also sick of living a life where she just said yes to versions of reality other people wrote for her. "If I'm the target, why hasn't anyone talked to me like I have any right to choose?" she asked, more to herself than to anyone else. That question alone is a powerful rupture, because it yanks you out of object mode and drops you back into subject mode in your own story. You might not be surrounded by squad cars, but maybe you've lived this in relationships, at work, in your family. Everyone deciding for you, pushing you, manipulating your fear, your panic, your guilt, almost nobody asking, "What do you want?" Olivia took a long breath, that metallic taste of adrenaline still in her mouth, classic sign of a body in total alarm mode. And she decided that if she was the target, she'd start acting like someone who knew it, not like someone lost in the middle of a shootout of narratives. "I'm not getting out of this car until you tell me exactly why I'm in the middle of this operation," she yelled out the window. It was the first time that night her voice didn't tremble as much. Outside, it sounded like defiance. Inside, it sounded like the first step toward dignity. "And let me ask you, what city are you watching this from? And in what area of your life do you need to ask this same uncomfortable question?" Out on the street, Mark felt the tide shifting, even though the physical scene was still under control. He was no longer dealing with a typical hostage, frozen by panic and desperate to be rescued. Now he had someone in front of him who knew, at least partially, that the hidden truth was a lot more complex than bad guy and damsel in distress. That internal switch in Olivia might not show up on any camera, but it was the variable that could ruin a lot of powerful people's plans. "They underestimated you," Ethan said, with a strange hint of pride, even in such a tense moment. "To them, you were just another woman who'd collapse as soon as she heard the word kidnapping on a megaphone. But you did what almost nobody does when they're scared. You kept asking questions. That's one of the most powerful things you can do in your life when fear hits. Don't stop questioning, because panic wants to shut you up, but hidden truth needs questions to come out of its hole." Olivia still didn't have a plan, still didn't know how she'd get out of that street alive and whole. But she had something she didn't have when she first got into that taxi: the awareness that she wasn't just running from fear, she was facing it with information. And that subtle, almost invisible internal step completely changes how the next move plays out. From now on, anything the police, Ryan, or anyone else did would have to deal with an inconvenient truth. The target was awake. Sitting in the back seat of that taxi, surrounded by sirens and people throwing words at her from both sides, Olivia felt something old wake up inside her. It wasn't just the panic of that night. It was a much older fear, rooted way before that street, way before Ethan, way before that file at work. While she stared out the window, watching blue and red lights dance across the glass, flashes of her past started popping up without asking permission. She remembered her teenage bedroom, small, stuffy, where she'd swallow tears so her mom wouldn't worry, remembered her father saying, "Just keep quiet, the people in charge know what they're doing," like questioning anything was a crime. That's where she learned a dangerous equation: fear plus silence, short-term safety, long-term damage. Years later, she had become a fully functioning adult, but carrying a behavioral manual based almost entirely on "don't make waves." You probably know someone like that. Maybe it's even you, who avoids conflict at any cost, even when the hidden truth is screaming inside. Olivia was exactly that kind of person. Good employee, good daughter, good friend, as long as that meant not upsetting anyone. The problem is, people who always avoid conflict make the perfect target for anyone who knows how to weaponize fear. In that taxi, surrounded by police, she realized this wasn't the first time she'd let someone else narrate her story for her. Except this time, there was way more at stake than a family argument or a disagreement at work. This time, the wrong narrative could cost her life, her freedom, or at the very least, her reputation. And while her memories pressed in on her, she started to understand why that old stuff she tried so hard to bury insisted on resurfacing that night. By the way, before we dig any deeper, go ahead and subscribe and hit like if you haven't yet, because this part is heavy, but necessary. At work, her story also carried fingerprints of things she pretended not to see just to keep going. She hadn't landed that job by luck. She'd fought hard to get there, for that badge that now felt more like a sentence than an achievement. She'd gone to college working days and studying nights, taken unpaid internships, killed her leisure time, swallowed dozens of no's. When she finally got a permanent position, she thought everything would be about competence, effort, merit. But she soon realized there was another game running in parallel, one you won't find in any handbook. There were informal meetings with only certain people, information that trickled down in drops, decisions made in hallways far from any official minutes. Once, she overheard two directors talking about adjusting numbers to make a report look healthier. Her fear kicked in. If I ask questions, they'll come for me. If I stay quiet, life goes on. Like most people, she picked the second option, shoving the hidden truth into a dark corner of her mind. You ever done that? Seen something wrong and thought, "Not my problem, better not get involved"? Those small concessions feel harmless in the moment, but they make room for much bigger things to slip through later. Olivia told herself, nobody's perfect, and that must be normal in big companies. But deep down, something hurt, a feeling that she was betraying not only her principles, but her own instincts. Now, in that taxi, with people trying to use her fear against her, all of that came flooding back, like a movie she never wanted to rewatch. And she could feel that this wasn't just a cruel coincidence. It was an old bill coming due, demanding her attention. There was one episode in particular she'd tried hard to bury, but that now seemed painfully connected to the panic of that night. About a year earlier, a guy from legal named Daniel had shown up at the office coffee area with dark circles and a strange nervousness. He talked too fast, eyes constantly checking the room, like he was afraid the air vents might be listening. "Have you noticed how many consulting contracts go through here with zero clear explanation?" he asked. Olivia shrugged, trying to keep her distance from anything that even smelled like trouble. Daniel pushed. "There's something huge in there, money going in and out in ways that make no sense. If this blows up one day, nobody will be able to pretend they didn't know." Her fear surged, and she did what she'd always done best, backed out, cracked a small joke, changed the subject, went back to her desk. A few months later, Daniel suddenly quit for personal reasons. Nobody talked much about him. Any questions were shut down with quick, canned phrases. The hidden truth hung in the air like smoke, but once again, Olivia chose to file the whole thing in "better left alone" and follow the routine. You ever think about how many Daniels life sends your way, people pointing at something, and you decide to look the other way? Now, thinking about all that inside the taxi, she realized that wrong folder that landed on her desk might have been connected to the same story. And maybe, without knowing, she'd stepped right into the exact patch of quicksand those people had tried to warn her about. Outside of work, her past also helped explain why she'd spent so much time trusting the loudest voice in the room. Olivia had been in a relationship where fear was a daily presence, but so well disguised she took years to call it by its real name. Her ex, Andrew, never raised a hand, never screamed in public, never caused scenes. But he controlled her passwords, commented on her clothes, criticized her friends, and shot down her dreams, all with that classic, "It's for your own good." Whenever she complained, he'd say, "You're too sensitive, you're exaggerating. That's not what I meant." Over time, she started doubting her own perceptions, like her hidden truth was always wrong when it came from inside her. She left that relationship emotionally exhausted, and with one crooked belief: maybe I'm just bad at judging people. Can you see how that sets the table for anyone who wants to use your fear against you? Because if you don't even trust what you feel, you cling to whatever the loudest outside voice says, even when it makes no sense. Olivia carried invisible scars from that phase, and that helped explain why, at the start of that night, she almost threw herself into the arms of the first authority who appeared. She had a long history of trusting other people's versions more than her own, just from sheer emotional exhaustion. Now, trapped in that taxi with police all around, she realized she was living a high-stakes remake of old patterns. And this time, she had the rare chance to choose a different ending. That realization hurt, but it opened space for something new, responsibility for her own lens. Olivia started to see that her fear wasn't just about what was happening outside, it was about everything she'd avoided facing inside. She hated the word coward, so she justified herself by saying she was just someone who likes peace. But honestly, how many times had that so-called peace really been just silence in the face of injustice, corruption, abuse? And it's not just her. A lot of people confuse peace with the absence of conflict, when real peace usually demands a confrontation with the hidden truth. Inside the taxi, as the sirens painted a movie outside, she was rewatching an old film in her own head. The times she watched bosses lie without saying a word, let family members decide for her, let partners define what was real or exaggerated. All of it, piled up, had prepared the perfect ground for someone to try and decide for her again that night. But now, the stakes had skyrocketed. It wasn't about being liked or avoiding awkward talks. It was about surviving with her integrity intact. You probably have a past like that too, full of moments when you chose not to see something just to dodge panic, right? The question is, how long can that work before it charges a price that's way too high? Olivia felt, for the first time, that maybe the cost of ignoring things now was higher than the cost of finally facing them. And that internal shift, as subtle as it was a kind of rebellion against everything that had kept her small. As she stitched those memories together, something outside began feeling off in a new way. She noticed how the operation looked almost too choreographed, like somebody had storyboarded that dramatic rescue before she'd ever stepped into the cab. Why so many cameras? Why were people allowed to film so close? Why did Mark talk like someone performing for a future replay? It looked less like a spontaneous response and more like a carefully designed show meant to be watched later. That triggered another uncomfortable memory: the corporate crisis management training she'd gone through months earlier. At the time, she thought it was overkill: simulated scandals, pre-written public statements, strategies to control narratives and limit damage. Now, those phrases from the training ping-ponged in her head as she listened to the language the police were using outside. The hidden truth started to sharpen. This wasn't just a high-risk rescue, it was also a reputational operation. If Ethan died there and she came out in shock, the story was ready. Criminal neutralized, victim saved, case closed. You see how that kind of clean ending is soothing for people afraid of messy reality. It's way easier to sleep at night believing in simple stories than having to wrestle with shades of gray. A shiver ran down her spine, not just from physical danger, but from the sense she was inside a staged narrative. And deep inside, she began to suspect that this night wasn't only about catching a dangerous driver. It was about maintaining a lie way too big to be allowed to fall apart on live TV. So let me ask you, what city are you watching this from? And how many times have you felt that certain operations were more theater than truth? Because it's exactly in that thin line between what's shown and what's hidden that the next part of this story goes. And with her past now exposed to herself, Olivia was about to see, with painful clarity, the lie at the heart of that entire police operation. Little by little, while the taxi stayed frozen in the middle of that siege, Olivia started looking at the scene with different eyes. At first, she saw squad cars, guns, police tape, all wrapped in a narrative of urgency and protection. Now she started seeing something else, a kind of stage set right there in the street, with lights, an audience, and very clear roles. Cops gesturing too much, cars lined up in a strangely perfect formation for cameras, reporters inching closer like bees to honey. It was as if the panic had been carefully choreographed to look like heroism later on a screen. She noticed how Mark kept repeating the same catchy phrases, like he was reading from an invisible script in his head. Hostage at risk, dangerous suspect, delicate situation. Words that explode fear instantly, but offer almost no concrete information. The hidden truth of that night probably wasn't in what they said to her. It was in what they were saying for the cameras, and that lit a whole new warning light in Olivia's mind. Was this really about justice or about image? Have you ever felt like someone cared more about how they looked than about what was actually happening? That kind of mismatch is often the first alarm that something is being polished on the outside and rotting on the inside. Inside the taxi, Olivia's realization didn't come all at once. It cracked slowly, like glass under pressure. Each new crack revealed a little more of the lie wrapped up as official operation, and it hurt to admit that maybe the people shouting, "We're here for you," were also there for a narrative they needed to sell. She started noticing details that, until then, had been swallowed by her panic. The police line wasn't as far back as it should have been from a high-risk scene, allowing cameras to come way closer than usual. Some officers, instead of staying focused on the hostage, looked more concerned with guiding angles for reporters. And Mark himself, between one line and another, kept glancing at the spots where he knew there were lenses pointed straight at him. He didn't look like just a professional doing his job. He looked like someone managing public fear with the finesse of a PR strategist. Olivia remembered her company's crisis management training and thought, it's the same playbook, just with uniforms instead of suits. The lie behind the operation slowly outlined itself in her mind. This wasn't just about stopping a dangerous man. It was a perfect opportunity to showcase strength, control, ready-made messaging, maybe even distract from something much bigger. If Ethan died there and she walked out in shock, the story would wrap up nicely. Bad guy dead, victim saved, end of discussion. You see how that kind of neat ending comforts people who are terrified of complexity? It's much easier to sleep believing a simple story than wrestling with a hidden truth full of gray areas. A chill ran up her spine, not only from the physical danger, but from the sense she was inside a performance she never agreed to act in. And for the first time, she wondered, if this is all so official, why does it feel so much like a facade? If you've ever watched the news and felt that question inside you, you know exactly the knot she had in her chest. And it's in that knot, between the fear of what's shown and the fear of what's hidden, that a lot of people give up thinking altogether. Meanwhile, Ethan was seeing the scene with the eye of someone who'd already lived on both sides, the shadows and the spotlight. He knew how to tell when an operation was really about catching someone, and when it was about sending a message. They're selling a ready-made plot, Olivia, he said, never taking his eyes off the rearview mirror. This whole thing isn't just about saving you. It's about showing the rest of the world that nobody messes with them without paying. When he said them, he wasn't talking only about the police, but about that toxic mix of economic, political, and institutional power. A network that uses fear as its favorite tool and panic as the fuel for public acceptance. That's how it works, he went on, in a bitter explaining tone. They create a clear villain with a face and a dirty past, a taxi driver with a record, and boom, everybody stops asking deeper questions. The deeper questions, in this case, were about the company, the suspicious contracts, the data she'd seen by accident that morning. Have you noticed how often public opinion is guided to hate a single face while the structure behind it stays untouched? It's much more convenient to throw rocks at one person than to question an entire system that produced that person. The hidden truth stays quiet in that process because it doesn't fit in a 5-word headline. Listening to him, Olivia started to realize she and Ethan weren't exactly enemies in that scenario. In different ways, they were both disposable pieces in a story that needed one obvious villain and one silent, grateful victim. And she was no longer so sure she wanted to accept that ready-made script being shoved down her throat. Sensing that time was going by and Olivia wasn't breaking as expected, Mark began adjusting his speech outside. "Think about your family, your friends, who's watching you right now," he shouted, now aiming directly at her social fear. That's a classic strategy. Use the fear of public judgment to push someone toward a rushed decision. She pictured her mother crying in front of the TV, co-workers gossiping in secret chats, neighbors whispering in the elevator. The public panic started mixing with the physical fear, creating a cocktail powerful enough to paralyze anyone. But along with that came another uncomfortable realization. How much of her life had she spent worrying more about what people think than about what was actually happening? That's when the lie behind the operation got even clearer in her mind. This wasn't only about arresting someone. It was about controlling the narrative so completely that everyone would thank them for the official version. "If you're so sure about what's happening, why do you need me to agree without knowing anything?" she shouted back from inside the car. That question, simple as it was, cut through the whole scene like a tear in the theater curtain. Have you noticed how people speaking the truth usually don't fear questions, but those propping up a lie always try to rush the conversation? Mark pressed his lips, visibly annoyed, because that wasn't the kind of reaction he expected from a hostage in panic. Even shaking, Olivia sensed she'd hit a nerve. Their need wasn't just to save her, it was to keep control. And in the middle of it, the hidden truth seemed to be laughing bitterly, watching everyone circle around it without the courage to face it head on. If we zoom out for a second and look from above, we can see a pattern that repeats in a bunch of other situations. It's not just in police operations. This happens in corporate crises, political scandals, even petty neighborhood drama. Whenever a situation threatens to expose something big, corruption, fraud, abuse of power, the instinct of those involved is the same: control the panic. To do that, they build a minimally comfortable story, pick a face to be the universal target of outrage, and rush everyone into believing it. The more afraid people feel, the less they'll ask questions. That's the cruel logic behind it. That's why headlines are full of heavy words: panic, chaos, danger, crisis, collapse. Because fear shuts off the part of the brain that loves analysis and flips on the part that only wants to survive. And whoever knows how to manipulate that can hide the hidden truth right under everyone's nose. That night, Olivia had the rare, uneasy privilege of seeing both sides, what they showed and what they hid. And you, watching this, also have that chance now to stop swallowing the first version they throw at you. By the way, drop a comment and tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'm asking because no matter where you live, there's always some safety theater going on at some level. And if this story is helping you see those layers more clearly, go ahead and subscribe and tap like. The idea here isn't just to entertain you. It's to train you not to be dragged around by panic without realizing it. Olivia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all this press down and, at the same time, wake something up inside her. She knew the danger was real. This wasn't philosophy class. It was her life on the line, right there, right then. But she also knew that accepting the ready-made version of events meant, in some way, signing off on a lie holding everything together. That's when the hardest question of that night formed inside her. What's more terrifying, to face fear consciously, or to flee it by accepting a role someone wrote for you? She looked at Ethan, worn out, sweating, but still trying to keep her one step ahead of the panic. Then she glanced outside, cars lined up, eyes staring, Detective Mark embodying the face of authority. And for the first time, she understood that any choice would come with a price, either the price of surface-level peace or the price of confronting the hidden truth. There wasn't a third, neutral, comfy path that would please everybody. You go through moments like this too. Stay or go, speak or stay quiet, trust or break away, fully aware that either way is going to hurt. Olivia, in that trapped little taxi, was standing exactly at that crossroads, with fear looming on both sides. On one side, the promise of easy safety, as long as she accepted being just another grateful victim. On the other, the brutal uncertainty of walking with her conscience awake, even while surrounded by panic and risk. And it was exactly from that razor-thin edge that the next phase of this story would be born. An impossible choice between trusting the law or the so-called criminal who'd decided to protect her. Sitting in that parked taxi, Olivia felt like she had two completely different worlds pulling her arms in opposite directions. On one side, the law, uniforms, badges, sirens, and that polished speech about, "We're here to protect you." On the other, a man with a dirty record, a shadowy past, and yet, the only one talking to her as if she were an adult capable of choosing. The panic in her chest screamed, "Go with the police. It's obvious. It's safe. It's what anyone would do." But a deeper fear, the kind that comes from intuition, whispered, "There's something so wrong in this story that you can't just obey." It wasn't a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between a comfortable lie and a hidden truth that hurt. Have you ever been there? Not in a siege, but in a situation where everybody said one path was the right one, but something inside you asked you to look twice. That's exactly when panic tries to grab the wheel of your life, because it hates when you slow down to really think. By the way, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? I'm asking because wherever you are, you're either already facing, or will eventually face, decisions where no option feels 100% safe. And that's why I keep saying, if this story is stirring something inside you, subscribe to the channel and hit like so we can keep digging into these layers together. What was happening to Olivia wasn't just a cinematic drama. It was an uncomfortable metaphor for choices everyone has to make at some point. She didn't have the luxury of deciding later. Every second raised the risk on both sides. Trusting the law might mean handing herself to a contaminated system. Trusting a criminal might mean believing a man who'd lied for a living. And in the middle of that crossfire, she had to decide which kind of fear she was willing to live with after that night. On paper, the law side looked like the obvious choice. Since she was a child, Olivia had been taught that police equals protection, equals the end of panic, equals order in the chaos. Movies show it, school reinforces it, family nods along, authority as a synonym for safety. Outside, Detective Mark embodied that idea perfectly. Firm voice, confident stance, pre-packaged phrases full of, "We're here for you." But now she knew things almost nobody out there knew. The audios, the files, the big names behind her company's spotless logo. The hidden truth Ethan had revealed made it clear that part of that structure might be playing on both sides. That didn't mean everyone out there was corrupt, but it only takes a few well-placed rotten pieces to redirect an entire game. If I get out, will I end up with someone who actually wants to protect me, or someone who wants to silence me? She wondered, stomach twisting. You've thought something similar when someone said, "Trust me, it's for your own good," but wouldn't give you concrete details, right? That's the problem with blind trust in any side. You put your life in hands that might not even see you as a person, just as a piece. The fear she felt now wasn't childish. It wasn't just about guns and sirens. It was fear of becoming a badly told story on tomorrow's news. Fear of being used to clean the image of powerful people. Fear of being an example so no one else dared touch that hidden truth. In theory, the law was the safe place. In practice, that night, it was mixed with interests she had no way to map. And trusting without a map, after everything she'd seen, would have been almost an act of blind faith, something she'd promised herself she'd never do again. On the other side was Ethan. If you looked only at his file, it was easy to tag him as dangerous. Ties to organized crime, shady nights, clandestine races, hidden recordings. He openly admitted he'd walked dark paths and helped sustain a machine that destroyed people. That past alone was enough to pump panic into anyone trying to decide whether to trust him. But there was something else now. He wasn't trying to pretend he was a saint or a victim of circumstance. When someone admits their dirt, as uncomfortable as it is, you sense a strange kind of credibility. It's harder to fake remorse than heroism. He could have left out the worst parts, blamed it all on Ryan, played the poor me card. Instead, he exposed his own rot and showed how fear and money had driven his past choices. And even so, that night, he'd taken the risk of being seen as a kidnapper just so he wouldn't leave Olivia in the hands of people controlling the operation from above. The hidden truth was that he seemed more afraid for her than for himself. "If I wanted to use you, I would have already done it," he said. And as strange as it sounded, it actually made sense considering everything that had happened. Have you ever met someone with a messed up past, but in the present, they were desperately trying not to repeat their old mistakes? It's uncomfortable to trust, but sometimes those people understand very clearly what real danger looks like. Olivia sat there, trapped between the institutional safety of the law and the bitter lucidity of a remorseful criminal. Her panic pushed her toward a quick answer. Just pick a side and get this over with. But that new clarity she'd gained that night refused to let the fear decide alone. If she went with the police, her intention would be to get away from immediate danger and hand responsibility off to someone else. But she'd also run the risk of becoming part of a story polished to protect those really in charge of the dirt. If she stayed with Ethan a little longer, the intention would be to gain time, understand more, and protect the hidden truth in her pocket. But that also meant facing the possibility that, yes, he could still be more dangerous than he seemed, and might be running a deeper game. There was no option without fear. See? No path that didn't hurt. It's just like real life. Sometimes you don't get to choose between fear and comfort. You choose between different types of fear. Olivia was beginning to see that blindly trusting the law in that context might be the fear of confronting the system. And trusting Ethan, even partially, was the fear of seeing, really seeing, what was behind that entire structure. You go through that too, when you have to choose between old, familiar patterns and the discomfort of new, unsettling truths. Neither choice comes without pain, but one of them usually leaves you more aligned with yourself. Meanwhile, Mark kept playing the role of the simple answer outside. "It's simple, Olivia. Step out of the car, leave him behind, come to the right side," he shouted, dividing the world into black and white. Anytime someone paints a wildly complex situation as simple, that's an alarm bell. Olivia felt like he wasn't just offering rescue, he was offering a ready-made emotional script, terrified, grateful, silent. The promise was seductive. Walk out of there carried as a victim, be supported, maybe even praised for trusting the police. But it didn't fit with the new information she had. If I leave now, knowing what I know, I'm not just saving myself, I'm helping bury this hidden truth, she thought. It was that moment when you realize your decision doesn't just affect you, it affects what story the world will tell afterward. On the other hand, staying in the car meant refusing that official script, and that could cost her dearly on many levels. She imagined the headlines: "Employee refuses rescue, stays with armed criminal. Reputation trashed in one sentence." Worse, it could justify more aggressive action from the police, using her supposed emotional shock as an excuse to neutralize Ethan. There really was no clean way out. Whichever way she turned, there was risk, judgment, and fear waiting. And in the middle of all that, her internal question shifted. No longer, which side is safe, but which fear can I live with tomorrow? In the end, her choice started to be less about who was innocent or guilty, and more about internal coherence. She remembered Daniel in the cafe, whispering about strange reports and invisible pressure. Remembered the ex who gaslit her into doubting her own feelings, the bosses who asked for silence, the times she bowed her head, not to cause trouble. If I walk out now, like this, I'll be repeating everything I've always done, letting someone else tell my story for me, she thought. Yes, that might keep her alive physically, but at the same time, it would kill her inside in a way she already knew too well. The death of someone who spends their whole life running from their own hidden truth. We're not talking about philosophy here. We're talking about that deep, physical discomfort of betraying yourself to fit into a convenient narrative. And yeah, she was not thinking all of this in a perfectly tidy, poetic way. She was feeling it in her body, in her throat, in that burning behind her eyes. She looked at Ethan and, despite the panic, saw someone who, at the very least, faced the dirt head-on, even if it was too late for him in many ways. She looked outside and saw a system that, maybe, preferred her as a passive extra in a story already written. The fear didn't go away for even a second. It stayed right there with her. But for the first time, it wasn't the only voice speaking. A thin thread of courage, born from finally seeing the hidden truth, started weaving its way through the chaos, and out of that tiny thread came the decision that would pull the next move. An escape plan so unlikely it sounded insane, but it was necessary. When the decision started forming inside Olivia, it didn't show up as some heroic speech. It came as a discomfort. I'm not just going to be carried around like cargo. She was still shaking, still full of panic, still afraid of dying right there in that taxi. But now there was something else, the certainty that she wouldn't hand her story over on a silver platter. Ethan noticed a different light in her eyes, something between despair and determination, and he understood that was the opening he needed. If you decide to stay with me for a few more minutes, he said, we can try something crazy. And it might be the only chance you have of walking out alive with the whole hidden truth intact. She almost laughed, that nervous laugh people have when they think, seriously, a crazy plan with this much police out there. But at the same time, she knew that just sitting there waiting to be rescued was basically agreeing to let other people write her version of the story. I'm not asking you to run away with me forever, he explained. I'm asking you to help me create just enough time and noise so the truth can leave this car with you. The goal wasn't to turn her into a fugitive. It was to turn her into a witness, too visible to be erased easily. Can you feel the difference? It wasn't about running away from fear. It was about using the panic itself to force the system to show its face. And how exactly do you plan to do that? She asked, swallowing the lump in her throat while her heart hammered out of rhythm. Out there, Mark kept repeating the same line through the megaphone. Step out of the car. Olivia, we're here for you. In here, Ethan was talking about a plan that would expose everything at once. Police, company, Ryan, whoever needed exposure. And before I tell you what he came up with, do this. Subscribe to the channel and hit like, because from here on, the chaos becomes calculated. This is where fear, panic, and hidden truth collide with something most people underestimate. The power of a camera turned on at the right time. Ethan knew he couldn't win with strength, or guns, or numbers. So he asked himself, what was the one thing he and Olivia had that the people outside were really afraid of? Exposure. Not the polished kind, with press conferences and official statements, but raw exposure, live, unedited. He looked at her phone, still buzzing from time to time, and saw something way more powerful than any siren. A way to speak without passing through anybody's filter. Have you ever gone live before? He asked, and she widened her eyes, not understanding. You're serious. I'm surrounded by cops and you want me to start a live stream, she snapped, half shocked, half offended. That's exactly why, he replied. As long as everything stays in official version mode, they control the story. If you show your panic, your fear, and what you know live, the hidden truth gets an audience before they get a chance to rewrite it. The plan was improbable, risky, borderline absurd. But in a world where a 30-second video can blow up a lie built over years, it made a twisted kind of sense. If we turn this taxi into our stage before they turn it into just a backdrop, Ethan said, you stop being just a hostage and become a first-hand account. The panic inside Olivia changed texture. Now, along with the fear of dying, came the fear of speaking, of being seen, of exposing herself. But it was also the first time that night someone offered her more than protection. They were offering her a spotlight, a say in her own story. You felt that too one day. The moment you realize you're not completely powerless, you're just terrified of using the power you do have. At that crossroads between the impulse to hide and the need to speak, the heart of that improbable escape plan was born. The idea wasn't to floor the gas and try to break through the blockade, ram patrol cars, start some Hollywood chase scene. That would have been suicide. What Ethan wanted was something more sophisticated and, at the same time, simpler, to change who controlled the narrative. If we try to blast out of here, they have the perfect excuse to open fire and say you were in panic, that I was forcing you to flee, he explained. But if you show up to the world saying, I'm here, I know this, this, and this, anything they do afterward will be seen in a different light. Can you feel the weight of that? Taking the story out of the hands of a few and throwing it in front of thousands of eyes at once. You're not going to run away from being seen, he went on. You're going to demand that everyone watching also sees what you see. And what happens after? She asked, trying to imagine a version of herself stepping out of the taxi under a dozen cameras. After that, you will come out, he said, but not as some grateful hostage with no idea what happened. You'll come out as someone the world is already watching. The plan, at its core, wasn't to escape the police, it was to escape silence, to make sure that, whatever happened next, the hidden truth of that night had already escaped their little metal box. It sounds insane, but sometimes the only way out of a trap built on fear is to become visible enough that the trap can't be closed quietly. And that's exactly what they were trying to do. Make it very hard for anybody to resolve the situation in the dark. While they were aligning this idea inside the taxi, the mood outside was shifting again. Mark, seeing that time kept passing and Olivia wasn't giving in, started hardening his tone once more. "Olivia, this is getting too dangerous. He's manipulating you. You have no idea what's at stake," he shouted, trying to drag her back under his version of events. Little did he know she already had some idea of what was at stake, and it was way bigger than that one cab ride. She picked up her phone with shaking hands, opened her favorite social app, and for the first time that night, did something that wasn't just a reaction. It was a choice. Her fingers trembled so much she could barely type the title, but she managed something simple and direct. "I'm surrounded by police inside a taxi. Please watch this." Can you imagine the weight of hitting "Go Live" in a moment like that? It's the kind of action that doesn't just change the situation, it changes the way you see yourself, from passive victim to someone who, even in panic, chooses to speak. Ethan watched in silence, respecting that it had to be her decision, her face, her voice. If you've ever felt that urge to finally tell your side, you understand the size of this moment. Before the first "Live" notification even appeared for anyone, Olivia had already crossed a line inside. She'd decided she was more afraid of being erased than of being seen. But the plan didn't stop at just starting the live. Ethan knew it wasn't enough to expose things. They had to create conditions that limited how far the police could go without burning themselves. As soon as you're live, you're not just going to tell people what's happening. You're going to ask for two specific things, he instructed. An independent lawyer and a member of the press standing here in person, not just footage from far away. He knew that having more physical witnesses on that street would make it way harder for any accident or misunderstanding to conveniently happen. You're going to turn your panic into a public question, not just a police incident, he said, almost like a strategist on a battlefield. Olivia listened and thought, since when did I become someone who asks for a lawyer and a journalist in the middle of a standoff? But the truth was, life had shoved her into precisely that role. The only one who had seen the pieces from all sides. You might also get shoved into a role you never asked for one day, the only one who noticed something nobody else wants to see. And that's when the oddest part of courage appears. You see yourself doing things you never imagined, not because you're fearless, but because you're more afraid of doing nothing. After the live starts, after you ask for those things, then you step out, Ethan said. But you step out with the world already watching. The plan was exactly that. Use visibility as a shield, not a perfect shield, but one that makes every move around you heavier and more accountable. It was insane, risky, and far from guaranteed, but compared to trusting blind in a script built on fear, it was the first thing that actually felt like a chance. While all this was being defined between shallow breaths and trembling hands, nobody outside had any idea what was coming. For the police, it was still a patience game. Surround, negotiate, wait for the hostage to break, storm in if needed. For the news crews, it was content, something dramatic to open the next bulletin. Images strong enough to keep people glued to their screens. For Ryan, watching from some safe distance, it was a problem he assumed he could still control with influence and a few phone calls. What none of them expected was that the quietest piece on the board, the ordinary employee, the woman in panic, would be the one to flip the game. Not with a weapon, not with an escape car, but with a live broadcast button and a shaken voice that refused to stay quiet. The whole street was about to find out that the most dangerous thing that night wasn't a bullet. It was a woman deciding, in the worst moment of her life, to speak the hidden truth with thousands of strangers watching. You know what's wild? Often, the most improbable plan isn't some brilliant tactic. It's simply the decision to tell the truth out loud. That doesn't erase the fear or cancel the panic. It just makes it much harder for lies to keep walking around unchallenged. Inside the taxi, their escape plan wasn't about running. It was about making sure that, no matter what happened, The story couldn't be edited without resistance. And when her finger finally pressed, "Go live," everything that came after would have to walk alongside that uncomfortable, exposed, undeniable truth. What really happened that night inside a taxi, surrounded by police, with fear, panic, and hidden truth burning in the dark. When the little "Live" notification popped up on Olivia's phone screen, it looked way too small to carry that much weight. But right there, in that tiny glowing rectangle, she wasn't just starting some random live stream. She was ripping a hole in the curtain built to keep panic and fear working in silence. The first viewers dropped in out of pure curiosity, just seeing the inside of a locked taxi, blue and red light explosions washing over the glass. Her voice came out shaky, but it came out, "My name is Olivia. I'm surrounded by police inside a taxi, and I need you to see this." Outside, nobody noticed at first. Their focus was still on the theater of the siege and the pre-written line, "Surrender, everything's going to be fine." Inside the car, fear and courage shared the same cramped space, wrestling for control over every word that left her mouth. "Don't end this live, no matter what," Ethan whispered, like he was handing her the only clean weapon left that night. She took a breath, steadied herself a little, and continued. "They're saying I'm a hostage of a dangerous taxi driver. But there's something much bigger behind this, a hidden truth that doesn't fit in a headline." Comments started flooding in, people asking what was going on, some doubting her, others already typing, "Oh my God," and "This looks wrong." You know how the internet is in moments of panic. Half the people think it's fake, half are scared for a stranger they've never met. This time, though, Olivia wasn't just a rumor. She was a face, a voice, a visible tremor in her hands. And that changes everything, because someone else's fear gets a lot more real when it's not just a name. It's a person looking you straight in the eye through the screen. By the way, if you're still here in this story with me, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit like because from here on out, things get heavy. This isn't just suspense, it's about how panic, fear, and hidden truth gain a body when the camera light points in the right direction. Out there, without knowing it yet, the police kept talking to a victim, while the victim had started talking to the world. It took less than a minute for one of the officers to notice the strange glow inside the taxi. It wasn't just headlight reflection. It was steady front lighting, that classic look of a phone in recording mode. "She's got a phone," someone yelled, and that warning spread across the squad cars like sparks on dry gasoline. Mark narrowed his eyes, trying to see better, and he noticed how she was holding the device. Not like someone texting, but like someone showing something. That's when the fear switched sides. For a few seconds, it wasn't Olivia who felt panic. It was them. Because suddenly, everything being said out there risked running up against a parallel version, unfiltered. "Olivia, put the phone down. That's dangerous. You're being manipulated," he shouted, trying to sound protective. But everyone watching the live heard it differently. Like someone trying to shut up a person who'd finally decided to talk. And she, still trembling, answered not just to him, but to everyone watching. "If it's so dangerous for me to talk, why are you the ones so scared of what I'm saying?" You see the subtlety. She used her own fear as an argument against the script they were selling. "If everything were as simple as you're saying, why does my voice bother you so much?" she added. The comments changed tone. "Show the outside. Film the cars. What's the detective's name? Tag the press." The hidden truth, until then sealed inside that taxi, began to seep through the edges of the screen, reaching people in neighborhoods, other cities, even other countries. And from that moment on, whatever they tried to do out there would have to walk side by side with that uncomfortable live broadcast, recorded, reposted, saved. Olivia flipped the camera and showed the whole scene. Squad cars, flashing lights, the detective with the megaphone, the crowd behind the tape. "They're saying I'm a hostage, but I'm here, conscious, talking to you, and I want to ask some questions out loud," she announced. This wasn't just venting, it was strategy, turning her own life into a public question. "First, why hasn't anyone clearly told me why I became the target of this operation?" she fired. "Second, why is everyone talking about his past, but no one is talking about what I saw today at work, in the files, in the company?" Outside, Mark tried to interrupt, calling out, "Olivia, stop, you don't know what you're talking about." But everyone watching saw something different. A woman terrified, yes, but thinking, asking, refusing to just nod along. If I don't know what I'm talking about, then explain it to me. Live here. Now, she shot back, staring at the glass as if she were looking straight into his eyes. You notice how hidden truth starts to leak out when someone refuses to be treated like a child. Comments kept exploding. Film the badge. Who's in charge? Someone tag a big reporter. This is sketchy as hell. That street, once the stage of a single, clean narrative, now had two camera angles, theirs and hers. And when two narratives collide in real time, the panic of whoever lied grows a lot faster than any siren, because fake panic doesn't hold up very well against real fear coming from someone telling the truth. Meanwhile, in control rooms, group chats, and living rooms, other people started noticing the broadcast. TV producers, independent reporters, people who follow weird cases, and professional chaos watchers online. The live stream left her circle of friends and jumped into sent to me by a friend of a friend territory, the exact path that makes a video blow up. A smaller news channel jumped first and put it on air. Possible hostage streams live from inside surrounded taxi. Suddenly, the story, once controlled by one megaphone, now echoed through Olivia's shaken voice, duplicated on dozens of screens. The hidden truth of that night started leaking out, not because someone allowed it, but because someone hit a button at the right time. Inside the car, she split her attention between the screen and Ethan, who, even scared, stayed focused. Ask for that lawyer again. Now it's not just a request, it's public pressure. I want an independent lawyer here, now, watching everything they're doing with me, she repeated, eyes flicking between the phone and the detective. You see the difference in weight between asking privately and demanding publicly. The panic was still there, but now it was accompanied by a new awareness. Visibility gave her at least some kind of shield. Did it guarantee safety? No, but it did make certain quick solutions a lot harder for some people out there to justify later. And slowly, the street stopped being just the backdrop for an operation and became a stage for a fight over story. Live, messy, global. In the middle of all this chaos, Mark found himself in a situation he hadn't trained for, having to answer in front of everyone. Olivia, we're just doing our job. You need to trust the institutions, he shouted, trying to hold on to his role as the rational adult in the room. But he wasn't talking to just her anymore. He was talking to thousands of people, some already suspicious, others just curious, others scared with her. So say it here, detective, Liv. What is my involvement in all this? Why me? Exactly me, she asked. He stumbled. He couldn't talk about the file, the company, Ryan, or the pressure from higher-ups. He defaulted to a generic line. You're at risk because you're with a criminal linked to a dangerous organization. Pretty phrase, clean, generic, and very, very far from what she had just asked. That doesn't answer my question, she shot back, voice still shaking but sharper now. Why did my data, my access, my routine suddenly become a problem today? You ever seen someone finally forced to answer something they've been dodging forever and failing miserably? Mark's discomfort was visible even on the low-resolution stream. He started recycling the same phrases, like a broken record. That's what happens when a lie is cornered. It repeats itself, because there's nowhere new to go. The fear was no longer just in Olivia, it was on his face too. Fear of slipping up, saying too much, letting a truth escape by accident. And in that clash, viewers on their couches or bus seats began to sense that the story wasn't as simple as it had seemed at first. Olivia knew she didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't going to turn into her own lawyer in 5 minutes. But she had something powerful, the ability to say, I don't understand, explain it to me, in front of people who count on everyone nodding quietly. She talked about the file without going into too technical details. Today at work, I received a document that shouldn't have been in my hands, with things way too serious for someone at my level. Not long after, I noticed people watching me. She didn't need to mention names. The pattern was enough. She talked about the feeling of being followed, the black car, the speed of the siege, the mysterious call on Ethan's phone. I'm not saying he's a saint, she added, but I'm not going to accept being used as a prop in someone else's pre-written story. You feel how strong that sentence is. I won't be a prop. That's what a lot of people spend their whole lives unable to say. to bosses, families, partners. The fear of being rejected, punished, abandoned keeps people stuck in supporting roles in everyone else's narrative. There, in the freezing night air mixed with sirens and camera flashes, Olivia broke that pattern live, in front of strangers. The hidden truth of that night was no longer confined to files, emails, and whispers. It had gotten a name, a body, emotion. And of course, that couldn't go unanswered, for the police, for the company, or for Ryan. Somewhere, watching the stream on some securely hidden device, Ryan almost certainly felt his stomach turn. He was a master at controlling other people's panic, at spreading fear surgically, at keeping hidden truth one step behind the official version. But none of that works so well when someone who was supposed to stay quiet suddenly starts narrating their own chaos. At the same time, Mark's bosses were likely losing their minds. Frantic messages, contain this, get that live down, fix the narrative. Thing is, once the truth starts leaking out in real time, you can't just hit rewind. At best, you can chase after it, try to minimize, sprinkle doubt, discredit whoever spoke. Olivia, with no idea who exactly her words had shaken, felt that her fear was now being shared by whoever watched, commented, shared the live, questioned, and refused to swallow the first version. She was still trembling, still scared of getting shot, still scared of being dragged off as someone in shock. But now she had a weird new kind of protection. Eyes, people watching, recording, reacting. You know that feeling, right? When you think, if nobody sees this, they'll do worse. And that's exactly the feeling that began shaping her next move. The consequences of choosing to be seen instead of just being saved. When Olivia decided to hit go live and keep her voice steady in front of all those strangers, she didn't just choose a path. She chose a type of consequence, a kind you can't take back later. Right there, still inside the taxi, she began to feel the immediate weight of it. Different looks, different posture, a different kind of respect mixed with irritation. Outside, some of the officers started moving more carefully, like people aware they were now walking on recorded ground. Others got even more tense, because panic with an audience is a lot harder to manage than panic in the dark. Mark, who a moment before spoke like he owned the narrative, now weighed every word, choosing syllables carefully so he wouldn't slip on camera. Ethan, on the other hand, looked at her with a mix of pride and fear. Real fear, the kind that knows courage always has a price. Because that's the truth. Every time someone decides to bring a hidden truth into the light, the system reacts. It doesn't just react with anger. It reacts with calculation. How to discredit, how to twist, how to turn courage into emotional instability. You've seen this before, right? Someone says something uncomfortable, and suddenly the focus shifts from the complaint to the way the person talks. In that moment, the risk of Olivia being labeled unbalanced, manipulated, or dramatic was very real. But at the same time, a different kind of respect began to appear, even from people behind the screens, at home, sharing her panic and her voice. By the way, before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? Following this story full of panic, fear, and hidden truth. And if this is making sense to you, don't forget to subscribe and hit like, because understanding the consequences of speaking up is part of real life. What was starting there wasn't just the end of silence. It was the beginning of a bill being charged from everyone. From her, the police, the company, and from Ryan. The first consequence came in the form of noise. Notifications, shares, messages from people she didn't even know. While she was still in the taxi, cut-up screenshots started to arrive from friends and strangers tagging journalists, influencers, lawyers, NGOs. Olivia couldn't read everything, but she saw certain words popping up again and again. Protect this woman. Keep filming. Something's off. The internet, which often feeds empty panic, for that moment turned into a strange kind of shield. Not a shield that stops bullets, but a shield that makes it harder for her story to be buried quietly afterward. At the same time, the other side of the coin appeared. People saying it was staged, calling her attention-seeking, claiming it was all a setup. Both sides always show up, those who support and those who attack, often without knowing half the story. The consequence of speaking your hidden truth is exactly that. You gain support from people who see themselves in you, and hatred from people who are threatened by what you represent. Olivia felt that impact in real time, reading comments that went from "I'm with you" to "shut up, listen to the police." Her fear didn't vanish. It just grew new layers. Fear of what they could do to her physically and fear of what they could do to her image later. But there was one thing they couldn't take away. The fact that, no matter what happened next, that video from that night already existed. And that alone changed the board, because the official version would never again be the only one. Can you see the power in that? Not of being a hero, but of making sure your story isn't told only by other people's mouth. That's one of the biggest consequences of facing panic. You lose control over how people see you, but you gain control over what you refuse to silence. The second consequence showed up immediately in behavior changes right there on the street. After the live started to spread and smaller journalists began showing up in person, the posture of the police had to adjust. They could no longer lean entirely on "trust us, we know the truth," without offering anything concrete. One of the news vans crossed under the tape almost recklessly, and a reporter with a mic yelled, "We want to hear Olivia's side." That kind of thing makes any command structure nervous because it breaks the script they control. Mark now had to negotiate not just with a hostage, but with a public that was starting to question whether this was a simple rescue or a spectacle. They called for backup, not just in numbers, but in communication. Press officers, spokespeople, people to craft an official statement, in case this escalates. Notice how the panic spread. Before, it was all on Olivia. Now it was shared between the institution, the company, and the people in the shadows. Ethan leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "The more eyes on you, the more careful they have to be with you. That's what we need right now." The hidden truth hadn't changed, but the way it was being protected had, simply because the exposure shifted the balance. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a bulletproof vest, but it was enough to make some people think twice before choosing the fast solution. You've probably noticed this in everyday life. When there's a witness, a lot of people suddenly become nicer, more careful, more correct. That's a big consequence of her choice. She forced many unwilling eyes to stay glued to a scene some people would have preferred to resolve out of sight. But the consequences weren't only external. Inside, Olivia paid a high price for that courage too. She knew with a painful clarity that that video would stick to her for a long time. The next day, she wouldn't just be Olivia from the department. She'd be the woman from the taxi, the one who went live, the one who confronted the police. That could mean losing job prospects, being avoided by people afraid of being associated, family members asking her to let it go and move on. The fear of social rejection, which had long been part of her story, now put on new clothes, louder, more visible, harder to ignore. At the same time, a strange sense of relief crept in. For the first time, who she was and what she had lived through weren't completely separated. She wasn't just the well-behaved employee who pretended not to see things, nor just the scared girl who swallowed every uncomfortable truth. She was someone who, in the middle of panic and fear, chose not to hide the hidden truth she had glimpsed. And that awareness, as painful as it was, gave her a sense of integrity she'd never felt this strongly before. You know that feeling when you finally stop betraying yourself, even if it complicates your life on the outside. It's not pretty, it's not romantic, and it's rarely comfortable, but it's real. Whatever happened after that night, Olivia knew she wouldn't go back to her old life intact. And living dead inside just to stay alive on the outside no longer felt like an acceptable option. Ethan also had his set of consequences, and they were as heavy as they were inevitable. By letting her speak, by encouraging the live, he knew he was signing a kind of death warrant with people far above the pay grade of any patrol officer. When Ryan saw that live spreading, he wouldn't see a taxi driver in a panic. He'd see a walking time bomb finally going off. The unspoken agreement between them, stay quiet and disappear, had been shattered in the most public way possible. Sure, Ethan could use the chaos of that night to try and dodge immediate capture, but the next day, he'd be twice the target he'd been before, and he seemed to have accepted that cost. "I've spent too long running from my own fear, Olivia," he said in a rare calm moment between outside shouts. "If this is going to mean anything, let it be that you don't end up as just another hidden truth buried in a report. Have you ever known someone who, even with a messed up past, reached a point where they tried, however clumsily, to even out the score by doing something right. It doesn't erase what they did. It doesn't make them a saint, but it shows that fear can be used differently when someone finally gets tired of running. The consequences of Olivia's choice landed on him too. Now, more than ever, he was tied to what she'd just revealed to the world. No matter what the system did with him after that, that night would always hold the record of him doing something that went against his own survival. And in a twisted way, that was the closest thing to redemption he'd ever had. In the background, far from the cameras and the sirens, the company Olivia worked for began to feel the heat as well. A live video of her talking about documents that shouldn't have been with me and things way above my position was circulating in internal chats. People from legal, compliance, internal audit, and the board were getting links, screenshots, transcriptions. Officially, everyone knew nothing. Unofficially, there was full-blown panic in the hallways and meeting rooms. Emergency calls, late-night video conferences, emails with "urgent" in the subject line. On the surface, they'd likely follow the classic crisis script: support the employee, cooperate with authorities, commitment to transparency. Behind the scenes, the fear was another, that someone besides her and Ethan might start connecting old dots. Contracts, shell companies, quietly handled resignations. The hidden truth, which had long been kept in folders, meetings, and whispers, now had a face and voice. That's something no crisis manual likes to handle. When the problem becomes human, emotional, and very public, Lisa from accounting might suddenly remember something weird. Paolo from IT might recall logs and access patterns. Daniel's abrupt exit might start to look less like personal reasons and more like something else. You've seen this in real life. One person speaks, and suddenly others realize they're not crazy for noticing things too. Olivia's choice wasn't just about her. It had the potential to awaken a lot of people who had also swallowed their own hidden truths in silence. And that's one of the scariest consequences for any system built on quiet fear. Once one person stops playing along, others start asking why they're still obeying. In the years that followed, that night would keep echoing in many lives and many places, inside homes, companies, institutions, and especially inside Olivia herself. It wouldn't become a romantic legend. There would be lawsuits, online hate, people trying to discredit her, days when she'd regret ever saying anything. But she'd also receive quiet messages from people saying, "Seeing you speak made me look at my own life differently." People stuck in abusive environments, dirty workplaces, relationships built on emotional panic and control. Some would leave jobs, others would report things, others would simply stop calling themselves crazy for feeling what they felt. That's the strange ripple effect of a decision made in pure fear. It can end up giving courage to a lot of people who weren't even there. Olivia's consequence wasn't just personal, it was generational in a subtle way. And if you're here with me, still watching this unfold, it might be because some part of you recognizes a piece of your story in hers too. Her life ended that night. The sirens turned off. The crowd went home. The news moved on to the next scandal. But the hidden truth that crawled out of that taxi never fit back into the neat, safe box some people tried to shove it into. That's the thing about real truth. Once it sees daylight, it leaves marks that can't be undone. And it's from those marks, on her, on Ethan, on the system, that the years later chapter of this story would be built. The day when one taxi ride stopped being a case and became a turning point. Years after that night of sirens and shouting, whenever someone mentioned the taxi case, they weren't just talking about a police operation, they were talking about a turning point in Olivia's life, in the company's image, in a lot of people's trust in the system, and even in how the public sees panic and fear. Now she sits in a simple studio chair, soft lights on her face, discreet microphones, that quiet hum of production in the background. She takes a deep breath before answering the same question she's heard 100 times in interviews and podcasts. "When did you realize you weren't just an unlucky passenger?" the host asks, curious, almost fascinated. She gives that small, tired, wise smile and looks straight into the camera, like someone who has already talked to millions without seeing a single face. "I realized it when the taxi driver, in total panic, said, 'Don't get out, trust me,' and the police surrounded us like I'd already chosen a side," she says. That sentence, which in the moment was pure fear, has now become almost a chapter title, the opening of talks, the first line of articles. On the other side of the screen, there are people who weren't even born when it happened, but who know the story through clips, edits, and threads. Funny thing is, it all started with an ordinary taxi on an ordinary night, carrying panic, fear, and a hidden truth nobody wanted to own. And hey, before we go deeper into this last part, take a second to subscribe and like this video if you haven't yet, because what Olivia learned that night, and in the years that followed, isn't just about her, it's about you too. It's about every time someone tried to sell you safety in exchange for your silence. Today, she talks like someone who walked through fire and came out marked, yeah, but still whole, with her conscience. And that's why this interview isn't just about revisiting a famous case. It's about remembering the day a taxi turned into a mirror of the world. The host asks her to go back in time, before the siege, before the live, before her face made headlines. If you could talk to the Olivia from before that night, what would you say to her? He asks, leaning forward a little. She closes her eyes for a moment, revisiting an old room in her memory, full of echoes, then speaks slowly. I'd say, stop underestimating what you feel. The fear that tightens your chest isn't always your enemy. Sometimes, it's the only thing showing you the hidden truth. She remembers how she used to lower her head at work, accept vague explanations, swallow discomfort so she wouldn't be difficult. Remembers how many times she saw something crooked and thought, it's not my problem, until the problem chose her. If I had taken the small signs more seriously, maybe I wouldn't have ended up inside a taxi with Ethan's past and that siege around us, she admits. But she doesn't say it with bitter regret. There's a strange kind of firm gratitude in her tone. That night, I understood that living with fear isn't the same thing as being controlled by fear, she adds. You feel the difference? One kind of fear paralyzes you. Another kind forces you to see better. On the studio screen, clips roll, the old live, the megaphone audio, headlines from that time. Each piece reminds everyone of something obvious. While she trembled in that car, she was also taking a step that would change other people's lives. By the way, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from right now. Because wherever you are, you either have lived or will live a moment where you have to choose whether fear will be a break or a flashlight. And that's what this stretch of Olivia's story is really about. Learning how to use fear to illuminate, not to hide. Then the interviewer gets to the part everyone always wants to know, but few know how to ask gently. And Ethan? For a second, it feels like the air in the room holds still, like even the equipment understands the weight of that name. Olivia looks to the side, like she's searching for the words on a wall somewhere, then comes back to the camera. There are things I'll never be able to talk about in detail, for my safety and for other people's too, she says, honestly. But I can say this. If he hadn't taken that route that night, if it hadn't been that taxi, I might not be here today to tell this story. She's not handing him a free pass, not calling him a hero, not washing away his past. That's not what this is. The man who carried guilt, dirt, fear, and panic inside his chest was on that night the only one who treated the hidden truth as more important than protecting himself. The official story tells his part one way. Hers holds nuances that no report will ever fully admit. He wasn't a hero. He was human, full of mistakes. But in that slice of the story, he was the only one who refused to let me be swallowed by a script they had written for me, she says. Maybe you've met someone like that, far from role model, but in one crucial moment, they did what nobody else had the guts to do. It's uncomfortable, because it shatters the fantasy that the world is split neatly into spotless good guys and pure villains. But it's much closer to real life, where fear and courage often share the same body. Quick flashes show old photos of Ethan, old news clips, bold headlines, harsh labels. She looks at them and quietly adds, that night doesn't fit in a single sentence. And in a way, there's still part of that hidden truth scattered between files, memories, and heavy silences. The host shifts the focus to the deeper aftermath. What did you lose because of the choice you made that night? He asks. She gives a small, half-grim smile, the kind that knows the answer is more complex than any talk show can hold. I lost jobs, lost friends who didn't want my name near theirs, lost the chance to ever be invisible again, she says. I also gained pains I don't wish on anyone. Lawsuits, veiled threats, sideways looks in places that used to feel neutral. She pauses and then adds, but I gained something I couldn't have gotten any other way. The certainty that, at least that day, I didn't negotiate my conscience. That's the part that rarely makes it into articles, but it's what really changes the direction of a life. We're terrified of panic, fear, and exposure, but we underestimate the silent terror of betraying ourselves. I'm not brave all the time, she admits, but in that moment, surrounded by police cars, I decided I was more afraid of being used than of being judged. You carry that in your own way too. The fear of speaking up, of setting boundaries, of saying no. And every time you choose silence just to keep the peace, some little part of your hidden truth shrinks. That's why this story isn't just about a taxi. It's about all the times you were pushed to accept a version of your life that didn't feel like yours. If this is hitting a nerve for you, make sure you subscribe and tap like, because these conversations aren't just stories, they're mirrors. The interviewer asks how all this changed the way she sees institutions. Do you still trust the police, the justice system? Big companies, he asks, with that mix of curiosity and caution. Olivia takes a breath, the type you take when you know anything you say might be used out of context. I stopped trusting acronyms and started trusting behavior, she answers. There are honest people in rotten places and rotten people in respectable roles. She doesn't glorify or demonize anyone wholesale, but she refuses to put anyone on a pedestal just because they wear a badge, a suit, or a fancy title. Now I ask a simple question whenever someone asks for my trust. Who benefits from the version they're offering me? She explains. If the same side always benefits, if the same circle always gets protected, she takes a closer look. If the only tools used are fear of punishment, fear of loss, fear of exclusion, she knows it's time to slow down. Think about your own life for a second. How many times has someone tried to rush you into a decision using fear instead of facts? When that happens, it's worth asking, what hidden truth am I not seeing here? Olivia learned that inside a surrounded taxi, but you don't have to wait for sirens to practice it. That's the point. Use someone else's extreme story so you can waste a lot less of your own life repeating the same mistakes. Near the end of the interview, the host asks the question that gives the episode its title. If you could sum that night up in one sentence for whoever's watching this now, what would it be? Olivia smiles faintly, looks down for a second, fingers twisting in her lap like she's sorting the words by weight. Then she looks straight into the lens with a steady, tired courage and says, I'd say, don't get out of yourself. Trust you. Listen to who's shouting on the outside. Listen to who's shaking on the inside. But in the end, don't hand your life's decisions over to anyone else. Your fear can warn you, panic can confuse you, but your hidden truth, what you know deep down, is always trying to say something. On the other side of the screen, someone pauses the video, swallows hard, remembering all the times they stayed quiet when they knew they shouldn't have. Maybe that's you, right now, staring at your own crossroads, hearing a dozen voices telling you what to do. And the real question this story leaves isn't whether Olivia was right or wrong. The real question is, what will you do when your taxi night comes? Will you choose the fear that shuts you up, or the fear that wakes you up? If this story stirred something in you, tell me in the comments what it touched inside you. And of course, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. They might not have sirens and taxis, but they'll always be about the same thing. The day you decide who really holds the wheel of your life. When I look back today at that night in the taxi, surrounded by sirens and different versions of the same story, I don't think only about fear and panic. I think about how many times, before that, I had already lived smaller versions of that same scene. No guns, no police, but the same feeling of being pushed to believe whatever was most convenient for someone else. That night, the difference wasn't how dangerous things were. The difference was that, for the first time, I didn't let panic decide for me. I stopped, still shaking, to look at my own hidden truth and ask, who really wins if I stay quiet? Who really loses if I speak up? And that's what I want to leave with you now that this story is over. It doesn't matter if you never go through something as extreme as a taxi being surrounded. You will go through moments where people try to decide who you are, what you saw, what you feel, and what you're supposed to do. You'll have a boss saying, just sign it, trust me. A partner saying, You're overreacting. It's all in your head. Family saying, don't make drama. It's always been this way. And inside, that subtle fear, that almost panic, trying to warn you that there's something wrong behind the official version. In those moments, you need to remember, fear didn't show up to humiliate you. It showed up to invite you into a conversation. The question is, are you going to listen? Or are you going to let someone else translate your feelings for you? If you made it this far, it's because some part of this story spoke to yours. Maybe you've stayed silent when you knew you should have said something. Maybe you trusted people who shouted too loud and doubted the ones who spoke softly but looked you in the eye. Maybe, right now, you're living your own taxi night, surrounded by opinions, indirect threats, and the fear of losing something if you say no. So let me ask you, eye to eye, in what area of your life have you been living like a hostage with no visible handcuffs? In what situation do you feel panic tightening your chest, but pretend you didn't hear the warning? And most importantly, what are you really gaining by staying silent? I'm not here to romanticize it. Choosing your own truth hurts. You might lose people. You might lose status. You might lose the comfort of believing that who's in charge knows what they're doing. But the alternative is much more expensive. Spending your whole life disconnected from yourself, living inside someone else's script. That night, I realized the real prison wasn't the taxi. The real prison was the belief that I wasn't allowed to question whoever spoke in the name of law, safety, the company, or the family. When I finally opened my mouth, shaking, crying, full of fear and panic, I didn't become a hero. I became an author of my story, my version, my hidden truth that no one else had the right to tell for me. Now I want to turn this back to you. If tonight were your turning point, who would you trust more? The voice outside or the voice inside? Are you willing to admit that maybe you've believed the wrong people for too long and silenced your own perception? If that bothers you, good. That's the right kind of discomfort. Start small. In a conversation, in a boundary you need to set, in a no that's been stuck in your throat for way too long. You probably won't need to go live from the middle of a police standoff, but you might need to go live inside yourself and stop hiding from what you already know. And now, I want to hear from you. What did this story stir up inside you? In what part of your life do you feel like you've lived or are living something similar, in your own scale? Tell me in the comments, not just for me, but for everyone who might see themselves in you too. If this story helped you see fear, panic, and the hidden truth with fresh eyes, do 3 things, for me, but mainly for you. Subscribe to the channel, so you can keep getting stories that aren't just stories, they're mirrors. Turn on notifications, because if you disappear, the algorithm forgets you. And with it, these reminders to look inward disappear too. Share this video with someone you